Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming in person, but also thank you to the online audience. So we have a very exciting afternoon today in which we have a symposium to discuss evolution beyond biology, generalizations, specificities, and applications. And we have a very nice and select group of people to show different approaches, different points of view, and to discuss this application of evolutionary theory in a much broader sense, meaning beyond biology, of course. That would be the obvious choice. So, and I would like to thank all the speakers for accepting this invitation. I think that, well, we were very vague about it, but in a way it was on purpose, so people could actually explore what they believe that it's more important or more pressing, a more pressing issue in terms of what we need to address nowadays in terms of evolutionary theory applied to other things beyond biology. And so thank you for joining Stolfo and I in this enterprise. And hopefully we'll have a very nice afternoon. We can, well, of course, the audience, both in person and online, are super welcome to ask questions. So people on YouTube, you can write down your questions on the chat, but also people here can ask questions. We are happy to translate the questions in any language that I can master. That I can master. And of course, we are happy to translate to English too. So feel free to do it. And as far as I know, is it okay to just ask questions during the presentations? Because the idea here is really not to have a very formal and, a symposium where you just sit there and listen. But so feel free to ask questions. We really want this to be an afternoon of discussion. So thank you. And without much further ado, I would like to invite Professor Mike O'Brien. He's a professor of history in the Texas A&M University, and of course, one of the most important people in terms of evolutionary archaeology. And so his talk is Evolutionary Archaeology, Time for a Refresh. So let's be refreshing. Thank you, Mike. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. First, thank you. Here, it's a real honor. My wife, way in the back, Gloria, came with me. She comes to everything with me. Never been to South America once, to Chile. Never been to Brazil, let alone Sao Paulo. So it's a real thrill to be here. And Astolfo asked me last night, "Why did you come?" We set this up, and I said, I came to find out what you're doing. I don't think there's enough interaction between South America. There is some between like Great Britain and the United States in terms of biology, especially archaeology, but not so much with South America, and I think that's our fault. We get so tied up in what we're doing. And so I thought I would just make a little trip south, a little 10 hours from Houston, but that's all right. We're having a great time here. So what I want to talk about is evolutionary archaeology, where it came from, what it went through, how it came about, and where we might be today. And again, I'm so glad that you said, please ask questions as we go along. It's no use you're sitting there for 2 hours thinking, I'm going to forget that question. So jump in anytime. It's not an interruption at all. I have to say, just let me ask quickly the background of people in here. How many people would identify themselves as, say, archaeologists? I know, it's like little alligator hands. Be proud of who you're there. Okay, good. How many biologists? Good. Philosophers? One. I'm really looking forward to your talk show. All right. if we go back to 1859 and Charles Darwin, and trust me, this is not a lecture on Darwin, which we all know, or do we? When I got into archaeology, I went to Rice University in Houston and the University of Texas to get a PhD, did a postdoc at Nebraska, and at the University of Missouri, I took my first real academic job. I'd always had been interested in biology and philosophy of biology, and archaeology as well. And I really bought into a lot of what was going on in archaeology at the time. We have an American saying called, I bought into it hook, line, and sinker. That means, fully bought into a lot of what was going on. And for the archaeologists, you might remember the term processualism, which has thankfully gone away. We don't need terms. And that's really part of what I want to talk about today is terminology. Because I started getting into this in the early 80s. There was one person ahead of me. His name was Bob. You'll see his name, Robert C. Dunnell, D-U-N-N-E-L-L. And he wrote a few papers that went nowhere. He wrote a book called Systematics and Prehistory that went nowhere. And Astolfo worked with Dunnell, studied with Dunnell for a year at the University of Washington in Seattle, and later translated the book into Portuguese. And he kindly picked us up at the airport the other day, and we got into this on the way, and I said, the next time that you translate that book, would you do it into English? And you think, well, if you've ever tried to read it, you'll understand what I mean. Anybody ever read that book or tried to read it? If I called on you, what is your name? Yeah. What is it? Can I? All right. Define for me the two terms denotata and significata. No, I'm kidding. Don't, please don't. I don't think I'd remember the difference. And that's what kind of evolutionary archaeology stemmed from, was this early attempt by Dunnell to put what archaeologists had done for years into some type of systematic framework. He was very influenced by another archaeologist named Louis Benford and processual archaeology, and came out of that. But one day realized, this isn't doing it for me. There's something missing. He had also been influenced by the American paleontologist, paleobiologist, Stephen Jay Gould, whom a lot of people in the profession outside of everybody had read his articles in natural history and other places that were assembled into books. And Dunnell started thinking about how can we do something more with archaeology that's, to his mind, scientific. And we do not want to use the word science or scientific or scientism, not all of those things out there. And he said to make it more Darwinian, that it seems to me that might offer an explanatory framework for what we look at as archaeologists. So he started working on that. He had a paper that had come out in '78, Style and Function. We don't have time to go into that today. We don't have weeks to go into that, but it was because people didn't know what he was talking about. And to be honest, he became probably my best friend. So when I talk about Dunnell, I have a right to talk about Dunnell because I was there from the start and we worked on stuff together. He was a brilliant man, taught me a lot. But his notion of style and function just didn't hold up for me for various reasons, but it doesn't matter. It was a great idea. It was a great dichotomy. Everybody bought into it, even though they didn't know what it meant, which is okay. That's the way science starts out. And then I kind of came along in the early 80s, and we kind of started working together, and even more work together to work on these things kind of in relationship to each other, as opposed to one person doing this and another one over here. Processualism, if we go back to Benford, which evolutionary archaeology came out of processualism, processualism was a reaction to archaeology that had been done the same in the U.S. for 100 years, plus or minus. Not quite that long back then. Go out, you dig things up, and you report. Time, space, time, space. Those were the things. Where did I find that artifact? What does it mean? There were even people back in the 1930s beginning, even in the 20s, beginning to think what Darwin had to say might make some sense in archaeology. And they were just beaten to a pulp. In the 1940s, there was an archaeologist at Harvard named J.O. Brew, and he wrote a review of, in one of his monographs, wrote a review of a monograph that had come out earlier. They tried to talk about, and he used the word lineages, but traditions and these types of things. And he said, and he wasn't alone, that's a bunch of bull. He said, pots don't breed. Okay, point well taken. Pots do not breed, but who breeds? People who make the pots, whether they're males or females, doesn't matter. And that was shut down for years. That was in the 40s. There'd be a few resurrections that came after that, but people were a little afraid, a lot afraid, just to get out there because they would be shot down by, there's biology and there's anthropology, and the two don't meet. Because in anthropology, you had some really fierce opponents to it, and, you know, you remember as grad students, some of you are grad students now, we don't want to make certain people in the discipline mad, so we'll just adhere to the party line, which is fine until you get out of school and get a job. Didn't even do it, you know, go do whatever you want. So Donald tried to make sense of this, looking at Stephen Jay Gould's papers, using his own great brain. We collaborated, and it dawned on us, I can't take a lot of credit for this. I credit to the Donald students that just sort of came up with this. You've heard of Richard Dawkins, maybe the geneticist. I don't like a lot of what Dawkins does and says, that's just my opinion. But in 1982, he published a book called The Extended Phenotype. And in it, he talks about what's so different from your body that houses your germline replicators, your genes, and a bird's nest, or in his terms, a catus, little insect nest. They're germline protectors. They're phenotypic. Just like your bone is phenotypic, your teeth are phenotypic, your skin color is phenotypic. Why not, in archaeological terms, we said, why not artifacts? What's the difference between a bird's nest and a house that, you know, a hunting and gathering group builds, or a pit that they make, or artifacts that they use to hunt and protect themselves? Just like claws are used to some animals use them to protect themselves. We argued nothing. And we started talking about this at meetings, and we were just, you know, people were like, oh, geez, some stuff that they couldn't get out of the traditional way. And I guess we were smart enough, or maybe lucky enough, to realize, all right, some people get really defensive, or some people, you know, just give up and go home. We weren't going to do that. Why? Because it takes time for ideas to get spread. We talk about fitness. Well, how many people know what, everybody, that's an insult to you. Who would like to define fitness for me? For animals, any animal, including humans. All right, we have to have somebody volunteer, or you're looking away, so it's going to be you. No, you're right. No, in English, no, don't tell me that. What is fitness? The ability to replicate, right? And what else? It's to reproduce. Does it matter if you reproduce? Nope. What's important? That your offspring reproduce. So you're reproducing viable offspring. Any kind of animal and humans, unless they're members of a sect that they believe in celibacy, No, they kind of go away unless, no sex, none. So what you want it to keep going, you need to bring people in from the outside, right? People. Is that different? Reproductive fitness from a biological sense, is it any different than your professor getting his or her ideas into your brain, and then you go out and get them into your student's brain, on and on? That's the way that evolutionary archaeology really began. Was I had some great students at Missouri. University of Washington had great students, including Dr. Cochran, who's going to talk to us in a little bit, and the University of New Mexico. That was about it. And then the University of Hawaii, where Dr. Cochran got his advanced degrees, became another center. So there were really 4, but that was it. But we started producing a lot of students who produced a lot of students. And pretty soon, the ideas really started spreading. To the point where I began to realize a couple of years ago that I use the term Darwinian archaeology, saying that. And then I coined a term in the 80s from a guy who we had as a one-year visitor at Missouri. His name was David Rindos. He wrote a book called The Origins of Agriculture. You've never heard of it, probably you have. He's kind of a crazy guy. We were sitting around one afternoon, and he goes, "Hey, man," he said, "all of this, you call it selectionist archaeology." And I thought, well, okay, selection is such a powerful force, process, not a force. Process, yeah, and it's the worst mistake I ever made. It's a terrible term. Why? Because is selection the only process that sorts variation? No. Drift, all kinds of things. We hadn't even started thinking about things like epigenetics. Very important. Niche construction. Hadn't even thought about that back in the early 80s. Probably should have, but you can't think of everything at one time, so you hope there's other smart people out there, and there certainly are, that come up with those ideas. But we started grabbing things and putting them in with care, because one of the things that archaeology is famous for, and has been for 70 years, is it's like 2 groups of hunter-gatherers. And you wait till it's really dark at night, and you don't want to make any noise, but you creep over to the other camp, intellectual camp in this case, and steal ideas, borrow ideas, take them back over here and use them with, oh wait, I forgot to get the instruction manual. Well, that was over there. So all of these things that I'm using, these terms, I don't know what they really mean, but they sure sound good, and it'll get me a job interview. Well, that's what happened in archaeology. Evolutionary archaeology could have been here today and gone tomorrow if it had been a snatch and grab. I'm afraid that some, like behavioral ecology did that. They do good work. But it's like we were talking at lunch. We don't need the term Darwinian. It makes no sense, because only 3 things matter in anything that's Darwinian, and that's why I'm interested in what you're going to have to say in a little bit. There's variation that's present. It has to be transmittable, meaning, you can go this way, you can go that way, you can go that way. It has to be transmittable, and there has to be a sorting mechanism that sorts it out. That's all it is. That's not quite what Lamarck had in mind, and people who put Lamarck here and Darwin here really haven't read the books, because it's tough. Things like soft inheritance. Darwin believed in soft inheritance for a long, long time. But he didn't believe in goal-directed evolution, which is what Lamarck, really, when you get down to it, that's what he was famous for, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so if we drop the word Darwinian, we have archaeology. Just the term archaeology. And that's what we're good at. It doesn't mean we all do it the same way. Or then you say, well, I'm scientific and you're not. Well, what is science? Their definitions of science as one of 3 sense-making systems in the world. And there are only 3, and I'm not a philosopher. But there's common sense. Oh, we know what we're talking about here. Everybody knows that. Or there's religion, belief, and there's science. And the 3 are totally different. I remember years ago in a cultural anthropology class that I was teaching at Missouri, I taught about 300 students in the class, and it was evolution from day one all the way. In about week 6, a young woman stuck her hand up, and I give her all the credit in the world because it wasn't like, what did you just say? What she said was, Dr. O'Brien, this is an anthropology class. It's been evolution from day one. And she said, yet I saw you and your wife and 3 kids at Mass on Saturday evening. And we're Catholic, and we were at Mass. And she said, what gives? Did you just take the kids, letting them experience this and that and the other, or what? And I said, no. Just believe in God. And she goes, you can't believe, isn't it true you can't believe in God and evolution? I said, wait a minute, whoa. I said, I don't believe that 2 and 2 are 4. What? I said, I know 2 and 2 are 4. And you give me 5 minutes and axiomatically I'll show you why 2 and 2 are 4. I said, give me the rest of the class and I'm going to show you why Darwinian evolution is a fact. And I said, it's not a belief. I said, I don't believe in evolution. And they were like, what? No. I know evolution's a fact. Put faith over here, put common sense over there, and this class is built on science. And we're not going to go into the scientific method, all of that kind of stuff. Well, we go along, and it comes up into the 90s, into the 2000s, and Donald gets very, very ill, and he finally dies. And it's left to me, but a bunch of students to carry on whatever it is, this thing we were doing. And one of the early things that I thought of, and I'll take the credit for this one, I guess, is using phylogenetic methods that are commonly used in biology for everything and apply it to the archaeological record. And you think, wait a minute. Well, we use genes, we use all kinds of things to create genealogies, and that's what we're creating with phylogenetic trees. If you look at Darwin's Origin of Species, and there's 410 pages, I think, in it, there's one figure, and we all know what that is, the tree of life. Bad term, but that's okay. To showing the branching, always branching, never coming back on each other. That's where the archaeologists had a heck of a time understanding this, and they threw it out the window. Because you can't talk about branching, because there's too much, let's use the word reticulation, back and forth. So it doesn't work. I was telling these guys at lunch, when we wrote the first paper on this, phylogenetics and archaeology, I sent it to the journal Cladistics, which was the leading journal in phylogeny at the time, and it got 3 reviews from biologists. Great, fix this, fix that, no big deal. One reviewer said, yeah, big deal is right. We know this, just put it over here. I was reading David Hull's Science as a Process, and if you've never read that book, it was 1988, University of Chicago. I really urge you to look at that book. It's just as good today as it was then. And he talked about the cladistics wars that were going on back in the 60s and the 70s, up into the 80s, where you had you know what phonetics is. You had the phoneticists, you had the naturalists, and you had the cladists. The phoneticists came out of the University of Kansas. Cladistics came out of American Museum of Natural History. Numerical taxonomy came out of Harvard with the likes of Ernst Mayr, all of that kind of stuff. And I was looking at this, and I realized the guy who had become the new editor of Cladistics would take one look at that paper. It had been accepted and rejected. 2 weeks later, I got an editor's letter, and it said, sorry. I gave it to a couple of friends of mine over in the Museum of Anthropology here at the University of Michigan, and they said, no, you can't. It's baloney. Too much reticulation, cross-pollination. The phylogenetic signal is totally lost. So they rejected it. So the editor of Journal of Archaeological Science, you archaeologists know that journal, took it like that. I told him what had happened. Showed him the reviews from biologists. My point is, with very, very rare exception, the biologists were like, Oh, big deal. Yeah, it's a good paper, fix this. Another use of cladistics on biological things which are the humans that the artifacts are proxies of. Just like a paleobiologist doesn't, paleobiologist doesn't work with living organisms. We can't use living organisms to talk about processes. We use the processes to talk about what things might have been like 10 million years ago. Archaeologists do the same thing. Now, the funny thing with Dunnell was, as good a friends as we were, that paper was coming out, and we were down in Mississippi State in the United States, driving around. We stopped at a little hamburger stand, and I was telling him about that paper, and we also had one accepted in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, totally non-archaeological journal. And he had said, that's the way he talked, He said, the biology boys are gonna have you for lunch. And I went, no, I don't think so. I said, we just had a paper, phylogenetic paper accepted in a Journal of Theoretical Biology. And he literally just about choked on a French fry. Dead? That was his conversion over to, he'd used the term extended phenotype, but he hadn't really thought it through. But he did. So that was another big contribution that it sort of filtered in. There was a book back in the 90s by a guy named Herb Mashner. It was called Darwinian Archaeologies. And I was like, there's only one. Oh, there's not. What we do as archaeologists today, Darwin, do we get hold of the three principles? Of course. But all of the stuff that 25 years ago when I wrote the book Evolutionary Archaeology, I was dumb enough, egotistical enough to think like, okay, we said it all, nothing left to do. We'd gone through and looked at biology, paleobiology, and how we had used those to make sense out of the world. Nothing left to do. Well, we're coming out with a second edition of it. It's been 25 years since that book appeared. It'll be another 2 years before it's out. But enough people said, no, that book needs to come out and you get catch people up with what's been going on. So much has been going on in evolutionary archaeology. I can't begin to know it all. So I've asked a couple of other people to, especially Europe, to come in and help me with it. And that's why I'm down here to pick Astolfo's brain and Ethan's brain to bring their perspectives into it as well. So where we'll be in another couple of years, I don't know, but there's tons of room for expansion. Niche construction theory had never been even talked about in archaeology until 2010 at the Society for American Archaeology meeting. And Kevin Leyland, a biologist from St. Andrews University in Scotland, and I put out an issue of Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory that talked about it. And that became part of the arsenal. But we had to be careful because we don't need 90-day wonders that go on these search and seizure missions and bring something back. And we knew that would happen, and it did. Big time. I want to be true to evolution, Darwinian evolution, but I don't want to call it that. But I don't want it to become a metaphor. And that's why I'm really interested in what you're going to talk about is, I don't see it. Some people have said, in early days, it's just a metaphor. It's change. Even Jay Gould himself. He and I got into a rip-roaring, big fight, argument back in the late 80s, early 90s over that very thing. I said, it's not metaphorical. Yeah, it is. No, it's not. Last year, some guys and I wrote an article that was in Evolutionary Anthropology called, because it was punctuated equilibrium, was 50 years old. And we had, the article was punctuated equilibrium at 50. Is there anything there for anthropology? Question mark. Yes, definitely. But not in that form. So we termed it punctuated evolution. Big difference. Now, Gould died in 2002, and I asked Eldridge, I said, would you like to work with us? No, he said, it's metaphorical. Okay? So we were doing another article for STEM, which is, I just blanked on it. Yeah. I mean, trends in ecology and evolution. And I asked him, I said, no. And then we got in talking about it. I showed him the stuff that he was not aware of, and he goes, oh, count me in. When he and Gould wrote the first paper in 72, I think, it was in a journal called Paleobiology, first edition. They called it punctuated equilibria. That was Eldridge and Gould. And I think the next one was an edited book by Tom Schaff they called it punctuated equilibrium. And after that, equilibria. And after that, the next one, without Eldridge knowing about it, Gould changed the name to punctuated equilibrium. That's what it's come to be known as, and he hated it. Gould didn't tell him that he had changed the name from equilibria to equilibrium. I wish they had kept it at equilibria, and so did he, because there's not just one equilibrium. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. If anybody has any real quick questions or whatever, we've got time, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Okamura. Anybody? Oh, at least one? All right.
Okay.
Oh, hold on. I guess you need.
My other question is, I was going to interrupt you, Mike, but I didn't know how to do it. But what I mean is, I think you should mention multiple transmission systems as part of what you've spoken about. Because not knowing the audience, I think some people could equate some things you said with there's genes to make certain kinds of pots, right? Which we know we can talk about two different transmission systems, and that's, I think, a big part of what we do when we're generalizing evolutionary theory outside of its traditional biological subject matter. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is, and that's a great point. When we talk about pots don't breed, no, they don't, but potters do, and what Dr. Cochran is getting at is the transmission system. It's called transmission from person to person to person. No accident that a mother makes a pot this way, teaches her daughter to make a pot this way, and on and down with little errors that come in. Or transmission comes in this way, horizontal, from outside, this way from teachers, this way from parents. So that is a totally different system, but it's a transmission system. And as long as we have heritable variation, and as long as it's transmitted, it can be transmitted, and as long as there's a sorting mechanism, then we have evolution. That's an excellent. Does that answer your?
Yeah.
No, that's an excellent point. Anybody else? Maybe.
In which this is more a comment than a question. I'm sorry. Just because. Sometimes when we talk about cultural transmission, and then people ask about this horizontal transmission or reticulation, right? And this has been going on forever since Kruber's, the tree and so on. But sometimes people forget something very important, that horizontal transmission, it's also very common in biological organisms. So it's not something that only in cultural traits you'll find this, and that this will mess, with your analysis and so on. So just to make this point, because I had so many versions of the same question through the years that now I have a slide dedicated to this in order to make sure that people do not forget that in the natural world there is also a lot of horizontal transmission.
Well, okay, both those points would have been in my presentation if I had done slides, but I didn't know we were doing slides, so I forgot to mention that. Probably those two important points that I should have made. Yes. Probably 40% of avian species are the result of articulation. Maybe it's 30, maybe it's 20, doesn't matter. Reticulation, crossbreeding, whatever you want to call it. Very important. But do biologists throw their hands up and say, oh, heck, I'm going to go be an English teacher? No, you work through it. We now have tons of ways, like biologists do, and linguists, historical linguists do, to make the best shot we can, take care of all of the reticulation that we see, knowing that there's no such thing as the perfect tree. It's never going to happen. I don't care whether you use maximum parsimony or Bayesian. I don't care what you use. It's never going to be a perfect tree. Well, it can be, I guess, if you have 3 species. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that's perfection. Ain't going to happen. So yes, those are 2 excellent points that have to be made. And again, I don't see any of this as metaphorical, because we're dealing with organisms. We're dealing with a chitinous shell from 10,000 years ago is a proxy for the little guy, a little water lived in there. Stone tools and pots are proxies of the people who made them. They were as the people making them were as subject to cultural transmission as they were to, call it, organic transmission. So, great point. Okay, it's all yours, Dr. Okamura.
Oh, there's a question. Oh, hold on. I guess.
Thank you for the lecture. The thing about here about archaeology, you know, Darwinian archaeology, seems to be much about like the modern synthesis of evolution. So transmission, sorting mechanism, you know, drift, selection. But there is a development on evolution. You know, you talked about those like extended niche, you know, extended phenotype, and how this impacts, you know, the archaeology. I was thinking, like, we see the pots, but you have the process to create the pots, and the process, they also, you know, they can also be selected, or the pot is selected, you know, and this thing are interconnected, and there's transmission. This thing, I don't know if you, but about the evolution of the evolutionary thought, you know, like there's this thing, I don't like this term, but like the extended synthesis on evolution, how does impact archaeology?
Extended evolutionary synthesis?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
I don't like the term, but some ideas are.
I like it.
Yeah?
Yeah,
so
I like it a lot. Okay, no, thank you. All right, 2 minutes. This is what he asked is I thought we were running out of time. Maybe I was wrong, but I'll make it quick. About, I don't know, what is it, 15 years ago, I guess, a group of, I don't know, it's like a gang, but a group of people headed by Kevin Leyland, who I mentioned at the university, at St. Andrews University in Scotland, and a number of other people, John Odling Smee, who was at Oxford at the time. They were looking at this, and they had been working 15 years on niche construction. That an organisms, they do things that create down the line consequences that they don't even know about. And the best animal, if you know anything about niche construction, what is the number, after humans, what's the number one niche constructor that everybody uses? You think of it as an animal. No, forget humans. Beaver. Beavers, yeah. Beavers are the ultimate niche constructors for getting humans because they build dams that help, you know, all of those downstream consequences. All right, so then they came up with this idea of the extended evolutionary sequence. Philosophers, biologists. And it created quite the scene. And when I was talking about that evolutionary anthropology paper that we did, we said punctuated equilibrium at 50. Is there anything there for anthropology? Question mark. Yes, comma, definitely. Because the war over extended evolutionary synthesis got played out in nature, and it said, is there a need for this biological synthesis, a renewal. Yes, definitely. And the other side said, no, comma, all is right, all is good. So I think, I'm with you. I guess the name is not great, but it's taking the biological synthesis. And if you'll remember, that came about in the 40s when the geneticists and the naturalists finally got together, people like Dobzhansky, Ernst Mayr, and others. And then they brought the paleontologists in, like George Gaylord Simpson, and Julian Huxley was the one that called it the modern synthesis. The unification, as it were. It really wasn't a unification, but it was, a coming together of minds. And that's the way it kind of came through until around, 2005, 2010, somewhere in there, that they started this movement. And guys, you know this as well as I do. If you want to be known and you want to get out there, how do you do it? You start a fight. Ernst Mayr at Harvard was great with that. Stephen Jay Gould was he just tear people apart. He and I got into it, and we finally decided, okay, let's just, go to your corner, we'll call it a draw, the day is done. Kevin Laidlaw and those guys were, they were great fighters too, and they went after it, and it got known. So now a lot of people, I'm not going to say everybody because that's an insult, but a lot of people know about the extended evolutionary synthesis. The big question is there a need for it? And I would argue probably so. A lot of the mechanisms, even niche construction, the people on the old side that say the modern synthesis is just fine, they would go, that's part of that. Well, maybe. But what came about were people looking for genes. This is really important. Looking for genes that were not brought about by natural selection. And there probably now are, last count that I made, about 55. We know, for example, sickle cell anemia and resistance to malaria. That was a cultural shift, big time in West Africa, no doubt about it. Can you think of another one off the top of your head that was a cultural push? And I'm using that word, kind of a baby word. A cultural push, not a genetic push, but a cultural push that made a huge change in Northern and Western Europe. Lactose tolerance. That was culturally pushed. Beginning with cheese, that people couldn't process it. They didn't have lactase. But once people had lactase that can tolerate lactose, what happens to the rest of the gene pool? It starts to expand, and that's exactly what we see over time. And I could go on. There's probably at least 50 more that we know were culturally induced. So I hope that answers your question, but the game ain't over yet. So I think there's going to be a whole lot more. And it all goes back to development. You use that word, development. And that's what we're talking about, is development. That's something that archaeologists need to take advantage of. We need to take advantage of a lot more coming out of biology. For example, constraint. I don't like the term evolutionary constraints. I like the term evolutionary bias. Constraint means I got you, you're never going to get out of it. Bias means for now, you can't. What happens tomorrow, we have no clue. The other one is mosaic evolution. We now understand that it's important. Modularity. Take a projectile point. In the old days, 10 years ago, we'd say, a point's a point. No, the base can change relative to the point, all kinds of things like this. Well, those are things that I'm not saying they're coming out of the EES, but at least people are bringing them back to the forefront that were sort of redlined a long time ago. Darwin talked about modularity, but he didn't use those terms. We just sort of forgot about it. So anyway, thank you. Yeah, oh, wait a minute. Yes, sir. I don't like people that are even within 20 years of my age because they know too much, but go right ahead. No.
I'm a teacher. I think I'm right about self-conscious of my profession, that teachers normally would reject that what they culturally transmit is how they culturally transmit is very different from how genes are transmitted. And I would like to hear what you object to this argument that transmission is an abstraction. That is not a critic. Of course, it can be a very correct abstraction. But maybe transmission in culture is very different from transmission in genes.
It is. Oh, there's no question about it.
And maybe that affects the theory.
You know, you raise a great question, but I don't see a difference as long as the information gets into the next. We talk about mutations in genes.
Yes.
Over long periods of time, we know there's going to be little bitty things that change. We'll just call them mutations out to the end. All right, in your class, what grades do you teach?
Normally I'm something like a socialist. I'm not.
That's good.
I'm teaching German sometimes, but,
no, that's
but normally I help people to come along in society.
What age would you have? Ages?
Maybe 16 or adults as well.
How many students in a class?
20.
Good, that's a good number. So when do you next teach? When is the next, tonight, tomorrow? When do you teach next?
Well, I'm not teaching now, but
all right,
I was teaching students of 16 in China. I was teaching German language to them.
Oh.
You can take that as an example if you
right.
like.
Well, I don't want to use the term, but have you ever heard of the game that you can play with students, telephone?
Yes, I was thinking about that in this moment when you brought it up.
In fact, it used to be
a lot of
called
different
Chinese
results
telephone,
come
but
out.
I would
Yeah.
use the word telephone. Yeah. So by the time he gets to the end of the 20th person, he tells him a sentence or a couple, whatever.
Yeah.
By the time it gets around, are you going to recognize it? No, heck no, because, oh, what did she just say? We'll put a new word in there. What are those? Those are mutations.
Yes.
The transmission doesn't have to go through genes. It can go through, we know it goes through people. Little bitty things here and there. Your son tries to perfect what you're doing, but doesn't quite get there. Last night we were talking about capuchin monkeys. You ever seen capuchin monkey? I've got a great picture of a father dropping a rock on a little nut to crack it. And you've got to hit it right on the top, you know that. And here's probably his little son, about that big over here, and there's a little nut on the ground. He's got this little rock like this. He has no clue what he's doing, but he's looking over at his dad. That's transmission. Okay, that's 3 great questions, comments. It's time to, uh-oh.
My name is Icaro. Professor, I have some question a little bit more pragmatic related Darwinian archaeology and cladistics, because in cladistics, Heine always say important traits are hereditary. We always need to pay attention for hereditary traits are transmitted, no? Because in phonetic always was, how can I say, a little bit random traits in combination to make comparison, no, about evolution. And then Henning in cladistic talk about hereditary traits. I would like to know in this Darwinian evolutionary archaeology, how to recognize that hereditary traits in analysis, no? For example, when we are analyzing some pottery, for example, how we select these traits to compare, to perceive evolution?
Next time I'm in Sao Paulo, I'll answer that question for you. No, that's a great question. Because how do you pick things? Now you're talking about Hennig, and of course that was 1966 when his book was translated from German into English. That's the last time I think we heard from him. But his points are still well made for the most part. We call him the father of cladistics, and he really was. Although nobody read it in German, it had to be translated in English first. All you can do is pick traits that you think are going to give you phylogenetic information. Some will and some won't. Just like when you do organisms. It could be at the genetic level, it could be at the phenotypic level. Not everything is going to give you information. So you've got to be selective, but that depends on you, the analyst, and your prior experience. And even more important, you've got to be able to sort out, going back to Hennig, and it's just as true today as it was then, things that get transmitted, things that are back transmitted, back to some other prior state, things that are not homologous, but they're analogous. We've talked a lot about that. Things that are, what a homolog and an analog are. Analog things that converge from different histories, homologous like that. Ooh, it's full of it. Thankfully, we have tremendous analytical techniques today to sort those. But by no means are you going to pick those traits, every single one of them, that's phylogenetically informative. It's up to you and your background. Just like when you pick an outgroup phylogenetically. That's up to you. If you're studying humans, would you use an elephant? You could, you'd get nowhere. So,
all phylogenies are hypotheses. All these trees are hypotheses, not the answer or hypothesis, then you then might evaluate in different ways.
right, they're hypotheses, as Dr. Cochran said, they're hypotheses that what? Lead to testable implications that then you go out and test. And we never want to forget that we use these words, unfortunately, all the time, just interchangeably. Yeah, but theory is, it's an explanation. That's all it is. It generates hypotheses, and we talk about testing hypotheses. No, the hypotheses generate implications. That if this hypothesis were to be found not incorrect, we don't prove hypotheses, then we should find A, B, and C. And we go test, just like you said.
Have to see what can lead to a phylogenetical signal, what cannot, and etc. So if you start with a theoretical background, this will help you to find, or not to find, but to choose which attributes from an infinity of attributes, because you have infinite attributes. So which ones you will choose? So everything boils down to theory. If you don't have a theory behind you to back your operations, your methods, and etc., you are at loss. That's the idea.
100%. Thank you.
Well,
We'll come back for questions and answers right at the end. So if you can remember it, let's do it. No, we'll make time. We'll make time.
absolutely. So thank you, Mike,
Yes.
for the great presentation. That's exactly what we were aiming for, something like very, not so formal, and that people could also ask questions and comments and so on. We have a question on the chat, but I think that it was partially addressed by you, but we can go back to the cladistics maybe after Ethan's presentation. So thank you very much, but you are not done yet. We still want to hear from you many other ideas. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Ethan Cochrane. He is an associate professor of the Faculty of Arts and Education in Auckland University in New Zealand. And we are going from 0 slides to 3 slides So that sounds very exciting. Do you need any help with this? Okay, so thank you, Ethan, for coming all the way from the other side of the world to share with us your ideas about evolution beyond biology.
Sure,
Thank you.
Let me put this on slideshow. Which one of those words indicates slideshow? Okay, thank you. Exactly. Oh my goodness, I really want to not talk about what I was going to talk about, but just kind of address things you talked about. Like, for example, your question about extended evolutionary synthesis and your response about the Nature article, which has the for and against. That's exactly, in my perspective, what scientists do. Scientists debate ideas, not stuff, because stuff just exists. The change of ideas we have when niche construction comes in or evo-devo comes in, new things don't appear out there in the world for us to measure. Or they always were there. The stuff is just the stuff. The empirical world's always there. But the ideas change, and that's what science is. It's debating those ideas that allow us to explain the stuff. And so all those, epigenetics, evo-devo, niche construction, all those ideas that people are asking, are they appropriate or not? That's exactly what we're supposed to do. And I don't really know the answer. I don't come down for or against one aspect of EES or not, but I think that's what we do. And your question about transmission, I instantly go to, I don't know if this is what you were intimating or suggesting, but I mean, transmission in the biological world is hugely complicated. As complicated as cultural transmission is. Again, epigenetics and the other, and chromosome flipping, and you biologists know more about it than I do, but biological transmission is not simple compared to cultural transmission. It's hugely complex. So I think the problems you might ask about cultural transmission, you could ask the exact same questions about how do we see these processes in the biological world functioning to create the variation we see there, the exact same stuff. And someone else, E-girl, you might have asked a question, but I don't remember exactly what it was. But anyways, so all those things are very interesting. And I'm going to talk about these topics right here. Oh, now I should scratch out the evolution from in front of the archaeology there. Just have archaeology must address these things. So as Mike said, I was trained through a couple of different institutions and also in this kind of application of evolutionary theory to the explanation of human cultural variation. That's what I do. I happen to do it kind of in an archaeological sense. And so I'm hoping that the biologists here and the archaeologists here, we have enough kind of common ground to talk about these things without having to kind of work through basic issues or ideas. So the biologists probably have to take some things for granted, and the archaeologists have to take some things for granted from both disciplines. But I have 3 whole slides. And actually, yeah, there's so much interesting things to talk about that I wanted to interrupt you, but it's hard to interrupt someone when they're speaking, but interrupt me. You can absolutely do so. One of the things I always tell classes, they say, and this is not, you guys aren't, but I always say, when you were students in an undergraduate class and the professor's waffling on about something, no one knows what's going on, and some person in the class, they're brave enough to raise their hand and say, excuse me, Dr. So-and-so, I don't quite understand what you're talking about. Everyone in the class kind of goes, oh, thank God. Yeah, they ask the question because no one knows what's going on. So if it gets that way where no one knows what's going on, ask the question and I'll get me back on track. But these are just some of my notes to talk about equifinality. So again, talking about equifinality, what I say, kind of indigenous concerns and relevance. That's what I think archaeology needs to address. And my particular kind of archaeology that I do, again, it applies evolutionary theory to the archaeological record. So one of these first things, in terms of equifinality, I'll kind of point out here that it's just as way of background. In 2011, I edited a book with a colleague of mine, Andrew Gardner, and that book was called Evolutionary and Interpretive Archaeology. And in that book, Andy, my colleague, who's a postmodern archaeologist, we kind of contrasted postmodern archaeology with archaeology that's based on evolutionary theory. And the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, and there are weaknesses of both approaches, I believe that. And we just submitted a draft of a chapter for a book that Mike's heavily involved in, coming out of Cambridge, which looks at evolutionary archaeology, or evolutionary theory and archaeology in general. And Andy and I we wrote again our kind of comparison of postmodern and evolutionary focused archaeologies. And in that chapter, this is 15 years later when I first wrote the chapter. In those 15 years, I've really come to appreciate that a lot of the archaeology that everyone does, but including archaeologists that kind of apply evolutionary theory to the archaeological record, the conclusions we produce really have this problem of equifinality. That is, we say this is the answer, but the answer really could be there could be multiple answers out there that are correct, but we're just choosing this one for some particular reason. And that's a problem, I think, of all archaeology, and evolutionary theory applied to archaeology must grapple with, is that and Mike kind of recounted the history a bit. A lot of the history of evolutionary archaeology in, say, the 80s and 90s up to 2000s was one where, I'll use the S word, where people applying evolutionary theory would say, we're doing science, and our conclusions are rock solid in that regard. However, when you really look closely at a lot of the archaeological work done using evolutionary theory, I'd say a good proportion of it, the answers have this problem of equifinality. Well, this could be the answer, but it might not be. It might be one of these answers too. And ideally, that's not how it's supposed to work. So I think that's something that all archaeologies need to address. And I guess I have this slide up here. That's simply a figure from a paper I put out last year in +1 on this big archaeological project I did in Samoa. I think I probably talked about that a year and a half ago in this very room, perhaps. But in this big paper, and that's just an image to remind me of what we're looking at. What you're looking at there is a valley in Samoa, and on the red lines on the right side are stone walls, agricultural field walls. Those blue lines are kind of agricultural ditches. And how we explain the development of this massive agricultural system in this part of Samoa and the Pacific Islands. We explain it by looking at differences in environmental variation, and yes, those agricultural systems begin earlier in better environmental areas. So we made an argument about kind of a ideal free and an ideal despotic distribution, which some of you human behavioral ecologists may know those terms. And then we made this argument about how individuals kind of increasing in status facilitate group decision making, which allows them to build this large agricultural system. And cut the chase, I think it's a really good story and a very likely answer. But it might, sorry, I might wave you off if you raise your hand, but then we'll get to you. That answer we have, it is one possible answer, but not necessarily the answer, and therefore it suffers from this question of it is underdetermined. The data we need to answer these particular questions in the archaeological record, whether using evolutionary theory or not, is not always generatable. We can't make it. And that's also you who asked the question about the evolutionary synthesis. I think you might have also been asking a question, all these complex processes that we want to understand. Some of those processes we might not be able to use to explain observations we make of the archaeological record, because the archaeological record does not have the data that we need. It is underdetermined. I think that's a possibility. You got a question? Yeah. Oh. I got it. What is this first map right here? This is a map of a valley in Samoa. Or Samoa is how English speakers pronounce it, but it's pronounced Samoa. So that's an island in the Pacific, and those red lines are a bunch of stone walls. It's a big agricultural field system, and the blue lines are ditches, which remove water from the system. On the other side, the left side, those are just sample locations. It's a big map of Samoa. Yeah. So anyways, I think my point here is that equifinality is an issue for archaeology to deal with, and evolutionary archaeology included. And my last little bullet point there is this is all something is it Charles Perrow? Charles Perrow, a book that many archaeologists know about. It came out 2019, I think, called The Quality of the Archaeological Record. And really, I'm just repeating Perrow's arguments that a lot of the kinds of things that archaeologists want to talk about evolutionary or otherwise, the archaeological record may not be able to furnish the data. We may not be able to generate the data from that record to answer those questions, that use some of those processes that are a part of evolutionary theory. But I'm going to digress for a second. And again, if we want, that's okay. What this brings up to my mind is that some people say, well, then you can't use evolutionary theory. I think that's wrong. And here's, I'll make a little thought experiment, for example. We know, for example, by looking, well, let me back up. We use different bits of theory, different kinds of theory, for different empirical records. And Mike was kind of getting this too with paleobiology. So we use evolutionary theory in a general sense to explain the results of human behavior, which are a part of the archaeological record. We can use other processes within evolutionary theory to explain variation in contemporary human behavior. Those are different records. And we can expect that different processes, which are all the sets of ideas, are going to be applicable to those different records. So for example, we might know that by looking at the contemporary behavior of primates, we know we can explain fitness, in some instances, by dominance hierarchies and sexual access amongst non-human primates, right? We can use those kinds of processes because we can observe that behavior. We could expect that in the fossil record, there might also have been species that had dominance hierarchies, right? That might explain some of their fitness, variation in fitness and even some phenotypes. But of course, we can't really use those ideas to explain that record because the observations we need to make don't exist in that record. It doesn't mean, oh, evolutionary theory is wrong, we can't apply it here. It's just that, no, there's some different theoretical concepts are designed to explain particular empirical records. And archaeology has to accept that, I think. But you had a kind of a follow-up question, or do you want to, did I answer it? Oh, what is equifinality? Is there a Portuguese translation? What?
You have to
Two different processes can explain the exact same phenomena, and you can't choose between the processes. That's what equifinality means. That's what I mean by equifinality. And so my example here was to kind of remind me that I have this explanation for a part of the archaeological record in the Pacific Islands, and I think this is the process that explains it. However, other processes might also explain it instead of the one I think best fits now. And ideally, I should be able to distinguish which process is the one that is explanatory here. But I cannot, and that's the problem of equifinality. And that's also an issue with what I'm suggesting is that the archaeological record, some questions we want to ask, we may never be able to get away from that problem. So the problem of equifinality. And I'll move on to another problem, unless anyone has any questions on this. Someone help me. How do you pronounce? Is there knock? Okay, thank you. Shingu. Okay, thank you. This article came out last week, I think, in Science. It's about this archaeologist, Michael Heckenberger, who's worked with Shingu populations in kind of the central Brazil, yeah, at the mouth, not mouth, but savanna area around the Amazon basin. So, what do I mean by indigenous concerns? That is something that I think archaeologists, again, of any stripe, need to address because we consistently work with the cultural patrimony, the material culture of indigenous communities or descendant populations, right? And this is nothing new to many people, nothing new to you. But this is a kind of ethical issue that archaeologists need to deal with better. And I was not trained to deal with this, I will say. Deal with this, that's a poor choice of words. I wasn't trained to kind of work in partnership with indigenous communities. And I wasn't trained that long ago. I got my PhD in 2004. But it wasn't, and I work in a part of the world, in the Pacific Islands, so I work in Samoa and Fiji and Hawaii. where populations that are indigenous and the cultural, the material culture remains is their patrimony, their ancestry. And my first little bullet point I have there is foreign archaeologists. That's me working in this place in Samoa. And the way I've worked in the Pacific Islands for the last 25 years is I get permission to do what I do from the communities that own the land, and it is their, again, cultural patrimony I'm working with. They give me permission, and I kind of do what I want. For the most part, and I'm not suggesting that I kind of go against my host's wishes. They simply don't really have much interest in what I do, I think, in a kind of big sense. And that's the way I have worked in the Pacific Islands for a long time. And I don't think that is not a viable long-term approach to doing archaeology anywhere in the world. Again, whether you're doing evolutionary theory or not. So I have foreign archaeologists there in Samoa. Samoan attitudes to archaeology, that's what I just told you, is that the Samoans I work with, I kind of think what I do is kind of strange. Like, okay, fine, you want to do that over there, that's fine. You know, go for it. We got more important things to do. and the people I work with find the results interesting, and it's kind of often it fits in with, or there's questions they ask. My collaborators in Samoa and elsewhere ask questions about, I can kind of say, here are the results of this work, and that fits into some of their ideas about history and some not, and so we have nice dialogues. But in the in the final analysis, it's not terribly important to them what my results say, what I do. It's kind of a hobby. I think for what we do to be, and this probably applies to biology too. If you're say you're a field biologist and you work in the Amazonian rainforest and you study some flower for some tree, right? Even that kind of discipline, I'd say for the spread of your ideas, for the health of your discipline, for the continuation of the kind of knowledge you construct, you need to, it would only benefit you to have the people you work with, whose land you work on, whose products you work with, to be invested in what you do, for it to benefit them as well. And that will just promote your work and continue your work and research. If your kind of landowners and patrimony owners are not invested in the results, I don't think that's, again, a viable long-term approach to archaeology. And so my point here is to bring up, I think it's Michael Heckenberger and his work with the Xingu. I just think that's, I know nothing about this archaeology except what I read in this science article on the plane even coming here a couple days ago. But it seems like a model for archaeology, a model of kind of research archaeology between foreigners and local populations. So I think that's something that we shall kind of consider. And lastly, in this slide, my point here about indigenous concerns is the different kinds of, I have to grapple with this, you have to grapple with this, we all have to grapple with this, the kinds of knowledge that I want to construct, the research questions that interest me. Of course, they're not always going to be the same as the questions of interest to the populations I work with. And that would be unrealistic to expect that. Just like my questions are not always the ones that Astolfo wants to ask or Mike wants to ask. They're not always going to align. But again, I think for the long-term viability, that is the kind of continuance of what we do as seed biologists or archaeologists or people who work in the middle, the communities within which we work are different knowledge construction goals. What we want to know, they should at least be interrelated, reticulated to some degree. They should work together. Again, I say should only because I think that will encourage the continuance, the continual development of our research and make it, as the word I keep using is viable, survive into the future. That's all I'm going to say about indigenous concerns, at least for the moment. Any questions about that? Okay. My last one. I'll begin with a story. This is actually an art installation. I live in Auckland, New Zealand, and downtown on the waterfront, there's an art installation. It's called the Lighthouse, or Tu Whenua Akura, is in Maori. It is like a big house. It's supposed to be modeled after what's called a state house, which would be like social housing, so government-provided housing. And inside this house is a giant chrome statue of Captain Cook. So Captain Cook is, perhaps you know, well known for travels throughout the Pacific and kind of first encounters with many populations in Hawaii, in Tahiti, not first encounter, but close after that. And so it's this giant statue, and you can kind of see a person here in the mirror. This is a person taking a picture with their phone. It's this massive statue of Captain Cook, yeah, all in chrome, inside this house. Anyways, the story is, my wife, who works nearby, was walking during lunchtime with one of her friends, who she works with, and my wife is native Hawaiian. The friend she was working with is actually a white South African. And they walked by, and my wife is in no way a strident indigenous activist. No, she's just native Hawaiian. It's no big deal to her. It's not, I mean, she's proud of her culture and heritage and does things like hula and all this kind of stuff, but she's not, again, not a strident activist in any way. And they were walking by the art installation on lunchtime, and my wife said something like, she told me this happened just like last week. She told me, I was walking by the lighthouse and was with Jackie, and I said, and my wife said, oh, great, Cook, and walked by. Because Cook came to Hawaii in 1778 and precipitated a lot of change in Hawaii, a lot of colonial change. Anyways, her friend Jackie was really offended at that, was really like, they had like a fight throughout. I mean, my wife's like, she just felt really uncomfortable. Jackie was like, oh, what? You don't think Captain Cook and Western society brought all this great stuff to you? And they were going on and on and on. And my point here, well, I'll get to in a second, is one of the things, like my wife's friend said something like, you wouldn't have that iPhone in your hand if Captain Cook hadn't gone to Hawaii. And so my wife is telling me about this, and I was talking to her about how you might approach that kind of conversation with people. My point here is that it's that first bullet point. Her friend Jackie is not an idiot. She's an intelligent person. She works in accounting in a law firm, etc. But so Jackie represents most people, I would say, who see the world as one of progress, that we are all, that is the goal of the world, is to get more and more technology or whatever. We're always progressing to something better, be it from a decade ago or a decade in the future. We're going to be better. We're going to have more stuff that is more technology sophisticated, which is, again, which is progress. And I put to you that the vast majority of people see the world that way. Maybe not us, because we're very privileged to be in a tertiary education institution with advanced degrees. But I think that is something, that kind of view of the world, which I put to you is very common. And I don't mean that the colonial racist view of the world is common, but just the view that the world is one built on progress, that we were always progressing. Although I guess right now people might, these days, there's a bit of, maybe not, but anyways, it's always getting better. And it's one thing Jackie said to my wife. She said, if Cook hadn't come, you guys would be still living in grass huts. And I point out to my wife, well, there's something to be said for living in small-scale village society. There's no homelessness, there's no chronic hunger, there's no mental illness to the degree there is in modern urban situations. But anyways, so I think that evolutionary theory is in archaeology, but also, not just archaeology, but generalized across social science disciplines, or kind of human sciences, if you will, that kind of, the use of evolutionary theory and the thinking of the concepts of evolution, so the debates and kind of extended evolutionary synthesis versus the modern synthesis, those kind of debates and thinking about evolutionary theory is we should continue to develop and think about these things and discuss these concepts, because they are a counterpoint to the idea that the world is in a state of progress all the time. Because as you all know, what evolutionary theory teaches us is that the world is not progress. It is simply variation, transmission, and selection. And evolution doesn't see a goal in the end there that we're all trying to get to. And so again, I think it behooves us. It's good for us to keep this in mind. The non-kind of progressive nature of evolution. So Tyler and Morgan, thanks, Mike. That's a good point. So this is how I'm going to take this. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, you have kind of armchair anthropologists or kind of gentlemen scholars, and they were gentlemen, men, I mean, who used ideas that were around the same time as Darwinian evolution, but were not in any way kind of linked in an explanatory sense with things like variation and natural selection and transmission. But those ideas filtered into kind of social sciences and humanities as evolutionary theory, and in particular perhaps the term cultural evolution, where those thinkers developed ideas like human societies can be divided into different levels. Originally it was savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Then the more common one was bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. So if you took an anthropology degree, you almost certainly encountered those terms used today, actually. Chiefdoms is big. But that kind of way to break up the cultural world into different levels of so-called social and political complexity had the terminology used was similar to that of Darwinian evolution, but in an explanatory sense, totally different. And I think that's one thing that actually my colleagues, my social anthropology colleagues, I'll say, not to bag on any social anthropologists who might be here, but some of my social anthropology colleagues, when I say the word evolution, they immediately react with, oh, well, that's ridiculous, because we know that bands and tribes and chiefdoms don't exist, and civilization, populations don't move through those levels of complexity. So that's what they think evolutionary theory applied to anything except armadillos and amoebas. They think evolutionary theory means bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states, and a progressive getting better over time. And that's not at all what Darwinian evolution is about, or how biologists apply it, or how archaeologists apply those ideas to the archaeological record. Is that kind of what you get? Yeah. But the world I put to you, as in the educated lay people, they don't make that distinction, and they can't blame people, because not everyone gets to go to university and do a PhD, right? You can't blame people for not making that distinction. So we need to kind of continually make that point, I think, that evolution is not progressive in that sense. And I think my final point, I don't know what my time is, but my final point is just this, that I'm not really talking about different things. Equifinality, indigenous concerns, and relevance. Those are all the same thing, and the three sides of a three-sided coin, right? They're the same thing. To make what we do relevant to the world out there, more relevant, we need to kind of, I think, combat this idea of, that the world is progress, but also we need to do that in a way where we can show people the evolutionary ideas we apply to explain the archaeological record. We have real answers that don't suffer from the problem of equifinality, and that's why you should care about what we do. Archaeology ultimately should not be butterfly collectors or stamp collectors who do little kinds of maybe neat studies, don't have a lot of relevance outside of what we call the academy, outside of our own scholarly conversations. We need to be able to make kind of really, I say empirically robust, strong answers that are important to people out there in the world. And that is one way that's going to happen, is through addressing equifinality. And another way that will happen is through working with indigenous populations, because what I've seen in my short time, in 25, 30 years in the discipline, is this increasing, and for good, this increasing kind of interrelationship and with indigenous populations that people like me, I study their cultural patrimony, They're increasingly being brought into the research themselves. And for that to continue, for what I do to continue, I need to, and we need to address their concerns. And again, those concerns will be addressed through addressing equifinality, making relevant kind of knowledge claims. All those things are wrapped up. And so those three things, equifinality, indigenous concerns, and relevance, I think, are things that archaeologists, evolution or otherwise, need to deal with. That's kind of all I have to say, though.
Thank you, Ethan, for... Well, I'm going to begin just because I don't want to ignore people who are on YouTube. So, but if anyone has any questions, please hold it, because I just want to make sure that we address this. But first, of course, I'll get the privilege of having the mic and say that, well, this thing about indigenous archaeology, of course, is super important, but it's also about the local communities, right? Yeah. Regardless if you really hold any sort of genetic or cultural relation to the past. Yeah. So I guess that everyone has the right to be excited about the past. And I've seen this many times in Brazil. You go to the local communities and they know nothing about what was going on there. They're really not indigenous, but still they're interested and they are excited about this. And I guess that this also addresses another very important question about, collectors, people that, like archaeology. They're amateurs, but still, of course, they can relate and be interested about archaeology. Another very important thing is that when we talk about evolutionary archaeology, I guess that for the scholars from humanities, that's also important, because maybe that's my hope, can make them see that humans are part of the biological world. I mean, it's a biocultural world, but nevertheless it's biological, because I've seen people that, I don't know, they believe that humans are something apart and very special. And it's very, very strange. So in a way, I really think that, people should read some more updated by by references and articles and things, about evolution. Because to not make these mistakes about evolution being equal to progress, I mean, this is very old, so come on, people, you can do it.
And I don't know what the answer is to that, because I tell your colleagues to read, but I agree. And I have I was in my own department, there was a presentation last year by a guy named Patrick Savage, and he is a cultural evolutionist, a quantitative cultural evolutionist who works on music, essentially music transmission. He's like working with massive data sets. Couple papers in PNAS and Science. Actually, he was on the Science paper that had to get retracted, the Big Gods paper. So, yeah, hugely important, intelligent researcher. And at my department, he gave a talk on that work. And one of my colleagues, her question was just like, she just said, I just don't like using the word evolution. I think it's misleading, or I think it's bad. It's essentially her conversation. And she kind of alluded to Tyler Morgan, 19th century cultural evolutionism. And Patrick's answer, he gave a mini history lesson, and he said, in that, just as I kind of did briefly there, and he said, look, evolution is the word we use because it's appropriate, because it's originally from Darwin, and this is the word, and so he said, I'm just taking it back, and this is what it means in, kind of cultural evolutionary science, and so I have no apologies for using this word, because this is the concept this is the label we give this concept, and and so that was his approach to it. Like he took it back and said, I'm gonna move on. I don't know if I interrupted you. Sorry, Mercedes.
I'm going to continue here, but have patience with me. So there's a comment on the chat saying, sad as that is, there is a relevant historical context which may help understand why social anthropologists and other in the humanities are allergic to evolution.
Sure.
Progressivist evolutionary thought is pre-Darwinian, but it was intermixed with Darwinian evolution in much of the 19th century talk. And even Darwin himself sometimes seemed to slip into it at times, which I agree, but you see, genetics was also mixed with very weird stuff to begin with eugenics. And we don't see this rejection, you know, from other people or even other scholars in terms of genetics. It's just, anyways, can I? Actual question.
Oh, sure.
Sure. Okay, so that's a question.
I mean, I think Mike knows much more than I do about Darwin's works, but yeah, I mean, undoubtedly that in mid-20th century in anthropology, kind of racist, cultural, evolutionary ideas are part of that mix. But again, that doesn't mean now we got to. Scientists are people too, and they make mistakes, and that's okay. And you make mistakes, you debate the concepts, you throw out what doesn't work, and you move forward with what works, and that's the way it's supposed to work.
Okay, so we have a question about the equifinality. So it begins like, I imagine João Cortese may mention this during his talk, but I think equifinality, as brought up by Ethan, is in many ways similar to the underdetermination of theories by evidence in
absolutely.
philosophy of science.
Same thing.
Is it?
From my reading of people like Perot, it's essentially the same thing. There might be little nuances that I don't know as a philosopher, but I treat it as the same thing.
Okay. So the other comments, underdetermination is a point brought up by Ellen Longino and others for arguing that values are not only inevitable but needed in science for theory choice, which in a way I believe aligns with the defense of relevance for indigenous concerns, as Ethan also argues for.
Was the question about kind of the development of concepts in science? Because Mike was mentioned that about Hull's book, Science as a Process. It really goes into great detail about all of the, the backstabbing and the kind of like, and the gossiping and the dirty play between scientists to like get their ideas promoted versus their competitors. And yeah, that's part of life. But I think ideally, of course, the concepts that win the day are the ones that work best, even if they might be promoted by somebody who's not a nice person. Yeah, hey, good to see you again.
So I have a question. I was going to interrupt to ask about the equifinality, but I was trying to formulate the question better. So you said that evolutionary theory in archaeology has to deal with the problem of equifinality in the discipline, right? So, but the way I see it, correct me if I'm wrong, this problem also exists in biology to some manner, right? Because they're both structured like at these types of historical sciences. Like we seek one positive evidence, then we have another positive evidence, and we make a link between them. And what happens like between them is where you can detect this problem of equifinality, right? So, and we are always trying to find new evidence between the ones we already have. So I don't know. What do you mean exactly when you say that evolutionary theory has to deal with this problem in archaeology? Because I think it also exists in the context where it originated, like in biology.
That's a very good question. And as you say it, I kind of want to retcon or go over again, change my argument. But I think it might be a very subtle distinction between the problem of equifinality or debating what are the better concepts to explain something. So for example, is the debate between the modern synthesis and the EES one about equifinality, or just which concepts are better for the observations we have? And that's a very kind of nuanced, to me, distinction. And I don't have the answer, but I haven't thought about that. But I think that's a really good way to think about the problem of equifinality, that it might, that's another way to recast that. and my understanding of the kind of EES modern synthesis debate is that, again, they're not talking about different data. They have the same data. But what are the concepts we use to explain that data? Yeah, so I don't have an answer to your question. That's a really good one. I don't know, does anyone else think about that? Oh, excuse me. Hey, Mike. Come.
A phylogenetic tree has a root. It's been rooted somewhere where a cladogram doesn't. Okay, we all know that. Do we know how good the tree is? As we said, there's no true tree of life. So equifinality plays a thing in everything the biologists do in terms of historical analysis. So what do we use when we build trees? Let's go back 10 years. The big things were consistency index and retention index. No, you get a retention index of 0.6. Not too bad.
Yeah.
But and you go on. We actually have trees with cultural things, coronets for one, and all kinds of things that have been compared against trees, biological trees, with better results, better being closer to 1.00. So we deal with this all the time. You do the best you can, and you move on. That's the best way I know to say it. But you can't just say, mine sounds good today, and yours doesn't. You know, there was a book written way back in the 70s. It's a psychology book called I'm Okay, You're Okay. You've never heard of that book, and you never should. I always wanted to write a book that says, you know, I'm okay, you're not.
Yeah.
So that's not the way science works. You know, we do the best we can and we move on.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. That all these debates about concepts. I mean, the answer is, and I know you're not suggesting this, is not like, oh, we just throw up our hands, we can't figure it out, we're going to go home and do something else. But yeah, it's just, I mean, that's what it is all about, is figuring out these concepts, which ones are best. Yeah,
Hi, Ethan.
ask somebody else something.
What?
Ask somebody else something. No, but I'm kidding.
No, it's just, I didn't get pretty much well. What would be the relationship between, I got it, what is equifinality, but I couldn't understand the relationship between working with the communities and like, what is the relationship between evolutionary archaeology or cultural transmission, or it would help to minimize the problem of equifinality?
No. I just think that archaeology of any stripe, of any kind, has to increasingly incorporate the concerns of the communities within which they work. That is what I see in my last kind of 15 years or so in academics, is I don't know what the word would be, but the bringing in, the inclusion of non-academic communities in research of almost any kind. I mean, in my universities, some of our promotion metrics are community engagement. You know, it doesn't matter if your paper is highly cited by a bunch of other eggheads. It's how, you know, academics, it's how does the community out there outside of academics appreciate or apprehend or use your work. And so I particularly am just talking about indigenous communities. That's who I work with. And I think that is, it sounds kind of stupid to say the future, but I just think that's probably going to be more and more important for the furtherance of archaeology and other disciplines that work with communities to increasingly incorporate their research concerns, what they want to know about the world, if we're to continue working in those communities. That's all I mean. That's what I don't mean. It's not necessarily, well, I guess how it's related to those other issues I brought about. I don't think most communities, indigenous or otherwise, just want me to help them tell stories without me. They want me to help them figure stuff out about the world. I want to say true, but I don't. It is like empirically based. It's robust knowledge. They might want my expertise to help them do that. Again, not just because they don't need me to tell stories. So I think that's where the kind of where the indigenous concerns are also interrelated with those other points I'm making about equifinality in this case. That really getting a robust answer is important for them and for me. Is that more clear?
Okay, so for the record, there is a comment on the chat saying that, so the person that asked about the equifinality, I completely agree that we need to take back evolution or rehabilitate it. I mean, just given the history of the concept in the humanities, we should be ready for an uphill battle. Okay, so.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think it's take back. Maybe just, get
not take back.
updated about what has been going on in the last century.
To some
I would
degree, and I
say.
think you've argued this before too, it's also just the science of the process thing. Hopefully, and again, ideally, the better ideas, the ones that are more useful, win out. So we are right now, and always have been, and always will be, in that process. And so what, is an uphill battle? Well, we're just generating knowledge that, we can argue is robust and long lasting. And that should be what is successful. I mean, I want to say if selective conditions promote it. Of course, those conditions can change, right? Yeah, and actually there's as you all know, around the world, funding is being withdrawn from non-STEM subjects. That's a pretty big that's a pretty big thumb on people, right? Yeah, and so that's all part of this kind of war. What's the cover process is like some battle scene from Rome or something like that, right? But yeah, it's a contest of ideas. And yeah, that plays out within this environment, and the environment changes, and different ideas may come to proliferate at the expense of others.
Okay, thank you, Ethan.
Yeah.
We are going to. We're going to have a quick break of 10 minutes, and we will be back soon. Thank you. É o seguinte. our symposium on evolution beyond biology. And for the second part, we'll have the contributions of Professor João Cortese, who works at the Biosciences Institute of the University of São Paulo. João, thank you for kindly accepting this invitation. I'm looking forward to hear what you want to tell us about evolution and generalization. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Mercedes. So thanks, Mercedes and Astolfo, for the invitation. I feel absolutely the need to justify myself, why I'm here, because it's a new field to me, but I'm really eager to do joint work on this, right? I'm coming from philosophy and thinking about the generality of evolutions, but this is more a research project than something achieved over years of inquiring, right? I'm just beginning. So I hope in some years I will have only 3 slides, and that in 30 years I won't have slides. Unfortunately, I have some slides here because I'm beginning, right? I hope to get there. And well, that's I will reach them. In some years I will keep arrive there. And well, the title I had it for another communication: How general could a theory be? And I hope you both have already listened to Caetano Veloso, the Brazilian singer, who has this song, How Beautiful Could a Being Be? He sings it in English. And when I gave the title, I could just hear this on my head, so this is the joke. But I'm talking from an epistemological point of view about how general could an evolutionary theory be. I will have a small introduction, more historical. Then I will go into the generality of a biological theory from a historical point of view, and then I will bring questions about the generality of evolutionary theories, right? So in 1992, Karl Popper wrote, "Science may be described as the art of systematic oversimplification, the art of discerning what we may with advantage omit." And a recent reference continues. What may be omitted depends on the discipline. Results that generalize to all universe, or perhaps do not even require a universe, are part of mathematics. Results that generalize to our universe belong to physics. Results that generalize to all life on Earth underpin molecular biology. Results that generalize to all mice are murine biology. And results that hold only for a particular mouse in a particular lab in a particular experiment are arguably not science, right? So one has already said all the history of philosophy is a footnote to Plato and Aristotle discussion on which generality one could find or not. And of course, nowadays, we don't want to have too much general models or too much general theories, of course, but we cannot hold only to the particular, because otherwise we are not doing science, right? We want to generalize it in some sense. And where to go, in what level to stay, this is the big question, right? So when we talk about general theories of biology, we have nowadays theories of biology that wonder about possible forms of life in the universe. Would an universal biology be submitted to evolution or not? Of course, we have linguistic evolution, cultural evolution, the subject of today, evolutionary archaeology, as essays to bring evolution beyond biology. And a recent manifesto claims that even the nitrogen cycle regarding its interaction with the abiotic environment could be understood as having an evolution, right? So we have a lot of quite broad general theories of evolution. This is the manifesto by Papal and Doolittle from 2024 towards a more general theory of evolution by natural selection. We will come back to this, right? The fact that there are a lot of these general theories are general theories of evolution by natural selection. We will come back to this. And, well, how to see it? And we should see this in context, right? We shouldn't just keep to Plato and Aristotle, but we should see where they were, and they were discussing with a lot of other sciences in Greece. And people say that at the door of Plato, there would be the saying, "Let no one enter here who does not know geometry." And regarding the history of the Institute of Biosciences, and more the institute of our department, we would have another phrase. we would have the phrase "nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." I think that perhaps in some years we will have here at the door of the Institute of Biosciences. You know the phrase, it was made by Dobzhansky in the context of the modern synthesis, and it bears some particular interest to us because Dobzhansky was at our department when it was in downtown, not here at the Cidade Universitária, and he was here for several times in the 40s and in the 50s, and we have still some inheritance from his teaching here in the department. So this is a kind of a claim for generality, right? Like to see biological sciences unified by evolution. Dobzhansky's courses were given here in 1943. They were translated and published in 1944. They make reference mostly to the second edition of Genetics and the Origin of Species, Dobzhansky's big book on the modern synthesis, and they were translated. And so André Dreyfus, who names the very building in which we are now, it was the first director of our department, wrote, "We know that diversity exists." This is the preface to Dobzhansky, right? "And if we want to make it compatible with the idea of evolution, the idea of the synthesis, that is, the possible transformation of living beings that inhabit the Earth, we will have to seek to uncover the mechanisms that could promote such evident diversity. Undoubtedly, what has made the greatness of genetics is the generality of its laws." So it's just a historical curiosity in order to show that the motivation for looking to generality is present in this context of Dobzhansky's claim, right? So Dobzhansky made the claim in two different articles. There is an article from 1973, which makes reference to a presentation in 1972, which has the very title, "Nothing in Biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." But there is a previous article, "Biology, Molecular and Organismic," from 1964, in which Dobzhansky writes almost the same phrase. It just crosses the order of the words. "Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution." And he quotes this Latin, "Subspecie evolutionis," in fact, taking an expression from Teilhard de Chardin, the polemical French paleontologist who was having a teleological evolution in some sense, and this was already noticed by Julian Huxley, who was one of the architects of the synthesis. So the idea of the light of evolution in some senses is inspired to Dobzhansky by Chardin, and it passes through Huxley. And what is Dobzhansky saying? How is it he's justifying this idea? So I take the first article from 1964. The article is called "Biology, Molecular and Organismic." And Dobzhansky is saying, we have nowadays an increasing unification of biology, which is dealt with by molecular biology, right? We are in 1964, so 11 years after the structure of the DNA being published. And he says, well, a spectacular progress in molecular biology surely acted as an unifying agent. But, writes Dobzhansky, I venture another and perhaps equally reckless generalization. He calls it a generalization. Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution, Specificities evolutionis. So he and also Meyer and others are replying to molecular biologists, saying, well, what you are doing is important and you have a generality in biology, but not everything is molecular biology, right? We have also history, we have also evolution, and this is important even for unifying biology. So the metaphor, to say so, is that nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And so Dobzhansky is saying, without evolution, without that light, all biology becomes a pile of sound effects, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. So Dobzhansky's argument is saying, if you take out evolution, you cannot grasp biology, you cannot understand biology, right? Without it, it doesn't make sense. And he will say that two things should be explained by generalization: the unity and the diversity of life. So I came back to the passage. I venture another generalization. Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. If the living world has not arisen from common ancestors by means of an evolutionary processes, then the fundamental unity of living things is a hoax and their diversity is a joke. So he says these are the both challenges that evolutionary theory should explain: how there is an unity of life and how there is a diversity of life. And it's really interesting because he says, well, there are some biologists that like more of the unity, that are others that appreciate more diversity. there's a kind of aesthetic appeal in this. One could even perhaps think about a subdetermination. You have the same set of facts. You can explain it from two theories. Well, how can you choose? Nowadays, one would talk about epistemic values, perhaps, and Dobzhansky is talking about an aesthetic appeal. And so some biologists will take more the unity and others perhaps more of the diversity. And I think it's similar for philosophy of science. If we think about the end of 19th century and the first half of 20th century, we have logicism and positivism and the essay to have it an unity for science, right? And since mid-20th century, we are always talking about the diversity of things. But even so, as I said, we should find perhaps a mid-level. And so how general could an evolutionary theory be, right? The question is, where are we standing on? I think we should make an interpretation of Dobzhansky's claim. Are we talking about an ontological level or an epistemological level? Let me explain it. When he says nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, is he saying that nothing in biology, that is to say, in the living world, makes sense except as having an evolutionary origin? And that would be a point for the unity underlying the diversity of life forms? Or is Dobzhansky saying that, claiming that nothing in biology as a field of knowledge makes sense except when studied in light of evolutionary theory? And this would be a problem of reduction, right? I think that clearly, that's my interpretation. Of course, if you do not agree, I would like to talk about it. But I think that clearly we are at the ontological level with Dobzhansky, right? He's not claiming that, well, everything should be explained by evolutionary theory. We have other biological theories, and they have their domain of validity, right? But from an ontological point of view, well, every form of life is subject to evolution. So you have an unification, but this is from an ontological level. We are just talking about Mayer's distinction between the proximate causes and the ultimate causes that nowadays is being revisited. I think it's 2015 perhaps that we have some important criticism around this. And Mayer was another one of the architects of the modern synthesis who wrote Systematic and the Origin of Species. And he has this classical article published in 1961 in Science called Cause and Effect in Biology, and the subtitle is something as Teleology and Causality from the point of view of practicing biologists or something like this. It's interesting because it was published in Science, and Mayer makes this very well-known distinction between a functional biology, which explains how things occur, and this would be the subject of biochemistry, molecular biology, ecology, and most parts of biology, in contrast to evolutionary biology, which would explain why things happen, right? Well, this is really polemical, of course, but in some sense, we seem here to have a dichotomy, right? But I don't think that this is in contrast or in conflict with Dobzhansky's view at all. Because Mayer is at the level of explaining things, right? He's not at the level of the ontological phenomena. So I think that one could have the unity of life with evolution without talking of a bipartition in the ontological level. We are rather at the explanatory level, right? And as we are recently hearing by a lecture by Mercedes at this very room, when we talk about historical sciences, we should, of course, recall that archaeology, as well as biology, paleontology, is a historical science. And Mayer doesn't talk about anything here. He will just, after when he takes this back in his book, he will say functional biology goes more into physics and evolutionary biology goes more into history as the subject of the humanities, but he doesn't talk about other historical sciences, right? So let me close this part of the generalization within biology from the point of view of Dobzhansky, contrasting and complementing this with a contemporary approach, right? So I'm talking about Samuel Scheiner, who was working on the National Science Foundation. He's a former ecologist, right? He's talking about ecological theory, and he's trying to reply to Dobzhansky in a sense. And he say, well, I can have a theory of biology, and he formulates nowadays a general theory of biologists and 5 general theories. He says, well, you have the theory of evolution as a general theory, but it is under the theory of biology and side by side with 4 other theories, the theory of ecology, theory of genetics, a theory of cells, and a theory of organisms. regarding molecular biologists and other things, he says, well, this is instrumental stuff, but, well, he has a strong claim. Of course, this is highly polemical. He's trying to organize what is biology today, and it's really polemical. But I want to bring a little bit of his theory because I think it could go alongside with the interpretation I gave from Dobzhansky, right? So he said, well, the single general theory currently recognized as so is that of evolution, but with a colleague he has proposed a similarly general theory of ecology, and now he's presenting equally theories for cells, organisms, and genetics. And he was presenting this with an encompassing theory of biology that takes 5 general theories. In doing so, I will take Dobzhansky's aphorism that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution and demonstrate that the complement is also true. He's trying to say that nothing in evolution makes sense except in the light of biology. He says, well, let us put evolution in its proper place. Evolution is just one of several general domains within biology. All of those domains intersect and interact, and none holds precedence. The theory of evolution has been given precedence because until recently it was the only domain with a well-articulated theory, right? Well, of course, you can also interrupt me if you want, right? Yes, Asofo.
And what's your take on this? Agree? Like, I don't know. I think evolution is still the base of everything. I don't know.
Great, great. I agree with it. I will try to show this in the next slides because, I mean, well, I don't have a claim. I'm not a biologist, right? I don't have a claim if these are the 5 theories of biology nowadays, of course. But I think that Scheiner, in some sense, he makes this claim, but in some sense, he betrays himself, as I think that ontologically, evolutionary theory is behind it all, right? I mean, there is a passage, I will come back to this, but he says, well, everything in evolution makes sense except in the light of the rest of the biology of the organism. In my framework, the theory of evolution no longer holds center stage. But he also writes, evolution appears as an explicit fundamental principle in all of the other theories, but the reverse is not true. So if you want, I can take at the end, and when he does the theory of the cells, he has the principle, you have evolution. The theory of the organisms, you have evolution, and everyone. Right? So, I mean, I think he goes halfway with this. But I think it's no problem if you think, well, ontologically, evolution continues to be what holds the whole thing. But, okay, from an epistemological point of view, perhaps, because someone who's doing cell theory should not at every stage look into evolutionary theory, right? But I think he's kind of polemical. Yes, perhaps, but he wants to make this proportion. He's an ecologist. He wants to put evolution in its proper place, you know. But I agree with you. Yes. Well quoted.
Is it well cited?
Yes, I think it had some impact. There is this Ishka Bible Society, the International Society on the History, Society, and Philosophy of Biology, something like this. So he presented this there. He was here at our institute 2017. I don't remember how many quotes, but it's being discussed. Of course, it's not fashionable as nowadays. No one is trying to do the unity of things, right? In some sense, it's hard to do this because, of course, each person will say, well, there are some details you have not agreed on, etc. But I think also he says that this came also from his work on National Science Foundation and like trying to evaluate what's the value of a project, what is scientific or not regarding a project. And he's doing joint work with people, right? As he's an ecologist, when he's doing the theory of organisms, he writes with a co-author, the same for the theory of evolution. And to my knowledge, he has not made something in more depth for genetics or cells, right? And so this is the first claim with regard to him. I think that ontologically, evolution is still there, and epistemologically, there is another frame. And besides, he has this proposal for a general theory of evolution. So he presented it in 2010, but in 2009, he co-publishes another article with a co-author, right? And what's his take on evolution? Characteristics of organismal lineages. He doesn't want to talk about species, but characteristics of lineage changes over the generations. Changing characteristics can lead to diversification of lineages. All organisms and their lineages are linked through common descent. There's a variation that among individual organisms in genotype and phenotype that is necessary for evolutionary change. The variation arises from the genetic properties of organisms. Of course, here you have genetic jumping in. Of course, it would not be evident that you should separate genetics and evolution. Evolutionary change, this is really curious how he writes the sixth principle. Evolutionary change is caused by deterministic and random processes. So he wants to keep neutral, and he's saying like, you have natural selection, you have drift, you choose your proportion between them, right? So he just writes like this. Evolutionary processes depending on the properties of organisms. He wants organisms to be there. And heterogeneity in the environment and evolutionary processes yield variable rates of evolutionary change. So he says you could have a gradualism, you could have perhaps a punctuated equilibrium or punctuated equilibria. I wasn't aware that there was a plural there. And he says, well, the proportion you want to do, it's in your hand, right? Well, so it's one among others theories, perhaps the most famous theories on defining a general evolution by natural selection is the one by Richard Lewontin, the units of selection from the beginning of the 70s, and that is took by nowadays, for instance, by famous philosopher of biology, Peter Godfrey Smith, and this was already said now today. You should have necessarily variation, you should have some inheritance regarding this variation, you should have some differential fitness, right? So if you want, we can try to map this into the Mendel and Shiner's theories. Of course, everything, each of these parts are present here in some time. Well, in some sense, it's one among other theories, right? We can discuss it if you want. And Astolfo already made me advance this. Ontologically, I think that evolution is still on the center of the stage, even for Shiner, but not epistemologically, right? And so I close my first part of the talk with this, claiming that when we say nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, this is an important claim, and it holds apparently for all authors quoted here, Dobzhansky, Meyer, or someone as Samuel Shiner, on an ontological point of view. From an epistemological point of view, this is perhaps more disputed, until where we should go with an evolutionary theory, right? Because perhaps, as some people say, Pigliucci, when writing a 2010 article on the generalization of biology, he says, well, we have some practice of biologists that doesn't claim explicitly for evolutionary theory, and this is okay, right? The biologist is not saying evolution does not exist, he's just not making a direct claim for evolution. There's a small parenthesis before the second part. I will make this parenthesis really quick. It's just to say that we could have some different forms of generalization. And I make this claim taking a philosopher of science, Evelyn Fox Keller, who passed away more or less two years ago. And in 2016 published this chapter, Practice of Generalization in Mathematical Physics, in Biology, and in Evolutionary Strategies, where she claims that distinct meanings and value for generality appear across different epistemic cultures, right? Even what we should call generality is not a consensus. And so I would be really quick about her example. She's giving an example of Nikola Rashevsky presenting a proposal in Cold Spring Harbor, 1934, explaining the cell division as a consequence of physical forces. So it's really a reductionist point, right? And Rashevsky is saying, do you need to assume some special independent mechanisms which produce at a certain stage of the cellular life a division, or are those mechanisms merely the consequences of more general phenomena which we know occur in our cells? Can I explain cell division from a physical chemistry point of view, or should I go into biology? And at the audience, there is Charles Davenport, who is discomfort with it, and explains his discomfort. I think the biologist might find that whereas the explanation of the division of the spherical cell is very satisfactory, because Rashevsky assumes a spherical cell as a model, yet it doesn't help, says Davenport, as a general solution, because a spherical cell isn't the commonest form of cell. The biologist knows all the possible conditions of the cell form before division. In the special cases of egg cells and cleavage spheres, this analysis may prove very valuable. But after all, these are only special cases. And so what Fox Keller takes from this example is that there are different senses of generality at stakes. Davenport says that the spherical cell is not particular because it is a particular kind of cell and lacks the generality with the meaning of something pertaining in common to various things. Whereas Rashevsky is taking a spherical cell as a model of a cell, and in this sense, it can be, well, quite general, as representing a class of objects, right? And so there are different claims about how to understand generality, right? And I take this as a motto towards the second part of the talk, because it's not evident when we are saying evolution beyond biology, what we are talking about, what kind of generality. So this is a recent 2021 paper by Baragit and Feldbacher-Escamilla on the many phases of generalizing the theory of evolution. I won't get into the details here. They are doing some Bayesian epistemology, but they are talking about 4 possibilities of comparison or unification. I do not exactly agree with what they call metaphor or analogy, but that's not a problem. So this is evidence, and this is a hypothesis. And in each case, you have the source and the target in the sense that we use in rhetorics, right? And so the source here is biological evolution, and the target is archaeological evolution or cultural evolution, or what you want in the sense. And they say you can have a metaphor when you talk in one in the way of another without having shared aspects. You can make this passage having shared aspects, so the X here represents the shared aspects. You can try to have a real generalization. And this would be to have the general theory of evolution, which is instantiated both in biology or in archaeology. And you can have reduction or elimination. This is perhaps more polemical even. You say, well, there is no theory here. Biological theory can fully explain, for instance, cultural evolution, right? This is perhaps, I don't know a lot of people which would defend this nowadays, but I think the real thing is here, right? Are we doing an analogy, or is there a strong unification with regard to a general theory of evolution, which is instantiated in biology or in evolution, or in archaeology or culture or language, right? I don't have a claim in it because you are the experts on it, so I'm bringing it on as a problem. From what we heard today, I think of course there are people who are making this claim, and I think it's interesting to debate what are the claims for having this claim for a strong unification, right? And I get by here with a little help from my friends because I'm not an expert on this. I'm beginning it. And Thiago Macek Gonçalvesan, who is hearing us by YouTube because he's not in São Paulo, he participated he's our integrant of our philosophy group. He did his master here at the Department of Genetics. And in this very year, he defended his PhD at the Linguistics Department in the University of São Paulo with a PhD thesis on the evolutionary thought in studies on languages, mapping the domain and making an epistemological investigation. It's a really interesting thesis, 600 pages thesis, so a lot of material. And he's not talking about evolutionary archaeology, but his discussion of cultural evolution and language evolution is very useful here. He presented me this very article, and he makes a table comparing different definitions of general evolution and general theories of evolution, and I want to comment on this table in order to do the last part of the talk. So Thiago, following Bock on a 2007 classification, it's saying that, well, some definitions are not generalizable beyond biology because in their very definition, you have biological entities. If you say that evolution is a change in the genetic composition of population, this doesn't apply to culture, right? You cannot apply directly this to culture. Of course, you can make some adaptations. So Futuyma has this strict definition on biological evolution as a change over time of the proposition of individual organisms different genetically in one or more traits. And you talk about genetics, you don't have culture. But Futuyma also have a definition of evolution in the broad sense, saying that the origin of entities possessing different status of one or more characteristics and changes in their proportions over time. And then you can get by with this, right? So You have several definitions that make claim of a biological aspect. I will come back to Barberhus and Mati after. And then you begin to have some theories that are claiming to be more general, right? So David Hull was quoted here, and Hull, as Dawkins, had this replicator-interactor framework. I saw most part of you know this. So the idea would be that the replicator is an entity that passes on its structure largely intact in successive replications, so typically the DNA, and the interactor would be an entity that interacts as a cohesive whole with its environment in such a way that this interaction causes replication to be differential. So typically would be the organism, but the language of this framework tries to be more general, right? And the problem is when we are talking about ideas or languages or perhaps artifacts in archaeology, you would tell me in which sense you have intact transmission. Of course, there we get to the details and there is the hard part of it, right? You have Bock's definition, Bock, who made the first part of this table, which is taken by Maciek, change in organisms over time with the minimum time being 1 generation. And several types of variation evolution exist depending on how information is transmitted from one generation to the next, and it's a theory on organisms. We have Lewontin definition took back by Godfrey Smith, we already talked about it. It's an evolution by natural selection, taking that one should have variation with inheritance and a differential fitness. Godfrey Smith would also talk in his book about Darwinian populations, which in the minimal sense would be a collection of causally connected individual things in which there is variation in character, which leads to differences in reproductive output, and which is inherited to some extent. This is a German contemporary philosopher of science, so Thiago is always quoting here people in their natural language, so you have here in German, then you have a footnote with the translation, but it is still more the 3 ingredient recipe, right? So you have reproduction, variation, and some kind of selection. And then you come into the authors which Thiago himself is working on, Nathalie Gontier and Papali, right? So Nathalie Gontier has this very, very broad definition of evolution. Evolution would be what occurs universally when units evolve at levels of an ontological hierarchy by mechanisms or processes. So 3 elements. It's really broad. Thiago says perhaps is almost too much broad, right, in some sense. So you should have some units. It would be, they should be in an ontological hierarchy, for instance, genes, organisms, and populations or species. And this would passes by mechanisms or processes. What's interesting to notice is that in Gontier's definition, and as for other authors that are making generalization here, when you talk about evolution, you are talking about changing, right? And so she took this into parentheses in order to say this is a synonym. Well, this is both a gain and a loss, of course, right? Because it's a gain because you can talk about changing in general, but is it perhaps lacking what's particular in evolution or not? This is the problem. So Thiago, for instance, he says one problem with this definition is that perhaps it takes the example of a stone being thrown. This is a process of change. In some sense, a stone being thrown, it could enter into this definition. The processes of a stone being thrown, in some sense. So we should take care with it. And Thiago will try to look into it. Let us begin with this. Well, this is Baravallis and Luke definition on a general evolution via the price equation, right? Lorenzo Baravalli was someone who was working on the Federal of ABC, and I think now he's back to Europe. He's an Italian philosopher of science. And there is Papali definition from 2021, which is also taken by Thiago in his own definition. So according to Papali, natural selection, defined as the influence of selective pressures from the ecological context, can be expected to be a major factor orienting evolutionary dynamics, that is, changes in the distribution of traits over time or populations, that minimally feature variation among constitutive individuals that lead to differential fitness, and memory. With memory, he refers, this is Papali, to the correlation between successive states of a population relatively to the distribution of variation. The more similar states, the stronger the memory is. So he's avoiding to talk about inheritance, and he wants something more general. So Thiago gives the example. He says, well, let us take an island, and then you have a volcano that closes, and you have a new population that has nothing to do with the ancient population, so you have no memory at all. right? So it's a pretty broad thing. So variation and memory, well, in some sense, inheritance. So the two elements of Lewontin and Godfrey Smith, in some sense. But not only that minimally feature this, but also that paradigmatically feature not only the two preceding conditions, but also regeneration. And regeneration is, in some sense, substitution reproduction, right? Regeneration for Papali is understood as the capacity of a population to sustain or increase its size through any processes of multiplication of its components, right? In some sense, reproduction. And so, there are these definitions that already talk about biology. I also said already that there are these problems with definitions as the one as Gontier. And so Thiago presents in his thesis his own theory of definition taking on Gontier and Papali, right? And what's the definition he proposes? Evolution occurs universally when units evolve or change at levels of an ontological hierarchy by mechanisms or processes. This he takes from Nathalie Gontier. Given that, at a minimum, at least one of the concerned processes is probabilistic, concerns complex interactions or some degree of uncertainty. And so Thiago takes this in order to avoid the process of the stone being thrown. So you cannot have just deterministic process in physics. And also at a minimum, the populations or groups of populations concerned have some level of memory in the sense of Papali, substituting inheritance with regard to this characteristic. In paradigmatic cases, you have entities at stake that go through or can go through some kind of multiplication, giving place to other entities. And Thiago also has some justification why he's taking multiplication instead of regeneration by Papali. So it's a candidate to a general theory of evolution. I think it's interesting because it's proposed by Thiago of our group, and it's a recent proposal, right? So in order to finish, as I said, I don't have any response to this at all. I just hope to be provocations that will give place to some debate here for you, the specialists in the subject. But I think, let me just, I think that this is a, oops, sorry. I think that this is a really big question, in fact, right? Are we talking about an analogy or are we talking about a real unification? And I think, from what I understand, that people working on cultural evolution, linguistic evolution, and perhaps evolutionary archaeology, thinks that the analogy is a problem, right? Because the strong claim would be to have a general theory of evolution, right? But isn't this a biologicism? How to say biologicism? An accident of a, well, I mean, what about if any domain has its value independent of having it from other sources or not, right? Isn't it a sort of purism to think just about this? I think this would be a provocation, but I don't have a stake, right? And I think we should have the details in order to look into this. I make an analogy just in order for us to recall that the question is general. When we teach about Thomas Kuhn and his revolutions in the history of science, generally students say, oh, okay, so we are saying that history is changing over time. Yes, of course, but this is almost a truism. This is not just what about Kuhn is saying. Kuhn is saying history changes over time with discontinuities that make ruptures that I can call revolutions, right? So he has a theory on how changes are occurring over time, right? And so I think we have a parallel here, right? Of course, we have changing going on in languages, in culture, in archaeological artifacts. The question is how much similarity does this bear with regard to biological evolution, and how much similarity does this bear to biological evolution by natural selection? Because as I told, there are some general theories of evolution in biology which are not so general because they are natural selection evolutions, right? Which do not take into account drift, mutation, and these kind of things. So for instance, Godfrey Smith in his books, he says, not all Darwinian populations need be changing. And the Darwinian population can change via non-Darwinian processes, right? So there's no problem a priori in order to have this, right? And so as Thiago says, you have some people, for instance, in philosophy of linguistics, which will accentuate the disanalogies, whereas other people who are trying to defend linguistic evolution will accentuate analogies. we can remember once more Dobzhansky claims there are people who prefer the unity, there are people who prefer the differences, right? And I think something of the same stake is here when we are talking about biological evolution and evolutionary archaeology, perhaps, right? So this is it. As I said, it was some provocations. I'm quite honored to talk after Professor O'Brien and Professor Cochrane, and I hope that this gives place to some discussion. Thanks again, Mercedes and Astolfo.
With a question. So these new names, or maybe new concepts, I see them more as new names for old concepts, right? So memory and regeneration, you know, these new names given by Papali. I mean, I don't know if you can answer this, but what's the reason behind this? Because I can see how that could be useful in a way for archaeology, but if you're working with biological organisms, why would you change, you know, why would you replace inheritance for memory or?
Yeah, well, but I mean, he's trying to make a general theory of evolution, right? So I think he wants to take the minimal, what he can, all from biological detail entities. Yeah, I think it's similar to who is talking about replicator and interactor. Someone could claim, well, talk about DNA and organism after all, right? I think, so what changes here is that you don't have the reproductive stages of organisms, right? You don't get, and I think that perhaps this could be, I was thinking about this when preparing to evolutionary archaeology, because perhaps you don't have so much the need to define strict generations, right? If things do not breed in some sense, well, if you have a concept as this, as a memory, you are just saying that successive states, but it's not generations, bear some connection regarding the distribution of variation of traits, right? So it's a more broad concept. And I think perhaps you can gain with this. And regeneration, the same thing. To sustain or increase its size to any process of multiplication of its components. So you are not compromising oneself with reproduction, right? So if we are talking about reproduction and inheritance, you have this generation model that is strictly discontinuous, right? You have individual organisms that can reproduce. Of course, you don't have to have sexual reproduction, but you understood, right? Yeah, I think it's less a discrete model than the general ones, right? And so Papali is arguing in this sense to have a more general.
I think the question is kind of maybe foundational. Can you go back to the one slide where you had your 4 models? Or 5, five conceptual.
Yeah,
this one.
The one from Baragita.
Can you review for us number 2 and number 3? Kind of explain them again?
Yeah, sorry. So X are the shared features. So they are claiming, it's highly polemical how to define metaphor and how to define an analogy, right? But they are saying a metaphor would be to talk about something in terms of the other without sharing any features at all. You are just using something, well. The analogy would be to take some elements in order to talk about the other domain. Well, you have a partial shared features, but you are talking about one in the terms of the other. So this would be to say, in my understanding of the schema, well, in evolutionary archaeology as the target domain, well, you have some shared features with biological evolution. And so you can take concepts or processes as natural selection or drift from biological evolution in order to talk about it. And when you are making this, they talk about a transfer at the hypothesis level, but you can read this as if you had this shared part of the structure as a really general theory of biology, of evolution. This would be and it gets almost instantiated in one of them. So when you say, well, as in drift in biology, you have also drift in archaeology, well, it's a comparison, but you could also almost make it at another sense, because you had a true generalization. So this is unification or generalization. And well, reduction was, you say there's even not theory at the other side. Yes, this is what I imagine, because I am, from what I understand, is that when people work in evolutionary archaeology or linguistics or cultural evolution, people will typically will have this kind of claim, right? But I mean, from an outsider point of view, I think I can make the provocation, as I'm really an outsider. Is it a bad thing if we are here? You know, because sociologically, of course, people will say, well, no, this is biology, as if one discipline is over the other. But is it a problem, finally, right? Because we have so much intercrossing between theories in the history of science. I mean, of course, I'm not claiming that the fact is here. I think we should go into the details. But I was wondering if there isn't something playing there as more into the identity of the field that sometimes go into here. But of course, the thing is go into the details in order to see if you have this general theory or not. Thank you.
Hello. Nice to hear your talk. I was thinking about I was thinking about this question before when I saw the subject of the seminar, but with all the talk, the question has changed, of course. But you dismissed the definitions of evolution that are like about any change, because like the tourism, that things change. But I was thinking about how this is not like so obvious as it looks like, you know, like people thought by thousands of years that species doesn't change, and that cultures don't change, that geologists, the position of the continents don't change, that the solar system don't change. So it's a relevant thing that things change.
Of course.
And how they change, like the foundation of science is like cinematics, that is about change. It's like to create a theory of change, of movement of things. But so I was thinking about how this is part of to have truly a theory of change, you know. Okay, so let me. And how the things change, that we can see, like, okay, so one thing is relevant, that for most things that exist, the past is important, right? So it's not like, oh, the things change and they bear like the memory of the things of the past, so it's important. And that the change is about external, internal forces. There is a hierarchy, but the hierarchy is not so rigid. The things interact in between itself. I don't know. So like, I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I also had this thought of how to societies compare to evolutionary change. And when I read like Levin's and Lewaltin and their meaning of dialectics, you know, that is like that very tem vários significados, né? It has very different meanings for different peoples. But to explain that a dialect is like a system that changes, that the change is of interconnected things, that the past is relevant, you know. I think that this is like a general ontology of the universe that is relevant to understand. And that I think that this comprises most of the definitions of evolution. So evolution could be like a dialectical process that has replication, because if you don't have replication, is development, not evolution. But my question is this: how think this is this important? This term dialectics and this, I don't know, philosophical stance, theological stance. on the understanding evolution and its generality. I don't know.
I had a reply until the end when you said what is dialectics, and then I don't have a reply. But well, about the general part of it, of course, I agree. I mean, it's right. It's really relevant that things are changing, right? Evolution is a kind of change, because well, I mean, Aristotle physics is a theory of change, right? The word of Aristotle for changing and for movement is the same one, so it's everything that change. And I think this is why Thiago, when he says, well, if you just say that it's changing, it could get back into physics. Is there something common, shared between physics and biology and archaeology and culture and language? Yes, everything exists on time. Each process exists on time, of course. But we don't want to talk about physics when we are defining a theory of evolution, right? So how can you exclude physics from this thing? And when you were talking, you saying that things are interconnected and they have a memory in some sense. And so this is why Thiago took Gontier's definition with Papali's definition with some things together. Because, of course, you can just say, well, things changing. Of course, but this is shared in some sense by physics and biology and cultures and archaeological artifacts, right? I mean, if I understood well, you come into the very core of the issue, right? How to specify what kind of change. This is why I make this analogy. I'm not saying that Kuhn is not saying that science changes over history, of course, but he's talking about how science changes over history. This is his thesis, right?
Okay. I think it's one thing that Kuhn says about science that is analogous to evolution. It's that it's not goal-oriented.
Yes.
So it's not.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, and that things are not machines. You know, that's another thing that's important.
Yeah. Well, from about the dialectical aspect, I can only hope that we will really have the 40 years event here about the dialectical biologists. The essentialists. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there would be a lot of debate here because when you have multi-level selection theory, for instance, well, units nowadays, people will say, well, genes are okay, but when you get into species or groups or other things, in which sense do they have an evolution or not? So I think there are ontological debates, even of what unit it can appear here in the model. Perhaps in this sense there would be because I mean, when you talk about groups of populations, of course, this is a model, but at the same time, we try to have models, as we are talking at the coffee. Our naive view continues to play a role here. We have populations. We want to have populations of things that we believe that are relevant, right? Of course, a gen is just a model, but we want to talk about processes. And I mean, could you eliminate any realism here in order for a completely instrumental vision? I don't know if this is how hypotheses are really generated, right? But yeah, but it's a great question. I'm fearing about time. I think we should move on, right?
Do we have any more questions? Just a quick comment from the chat. Where,
there?
Yes, Thiago is saying that
Thank you a lot, Thiago.
interestingly, Papali does give specific biological examples where, in his view, at least, memory and multiplication, maybe it's regeneration, right? Work better than strict concepts of inheritance and reproduction. Super interesting article, so maybe people should read and go deep into this topic.
Fine.
Well, thank you very much, João. aqui em aplausos.
Mhm.
And so, well, and then finally we will have the presentation by Astolfo Araújo, and I see that we are sharing this, so of course all the mistaken ideas are his responsibility. It's a joke. So Astolfo is a professor at the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of the University of São Paulo, and of course he has the responsibility as well of organizing this and inviting all these people to talk today. So thank you, Astolfo, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I have to thank a lot both Ethan and Mike for being here. Say this for helping to set up all this symposium. In order to not be very progressivist, I will make a mix here, so I will have lots of slides. I will read a bit, so it will be different from the other speakers, just because I don't want you to see any progressivism in terms of number of slides and things like this. So I will go really fast here, talk about ontology really fast. Now, it's the nature of the entities who does exist. I will talk about these very general things, and then I will change subject, and in the end, I hope they will converge. But just for the general audience, people that who are in YouTube, for have an idea of what we are talking about. Ontology deals with this nature of the entities that exist, the establishment of basic concepts. Everything, like ontology will define the theory, the methods, and the techniques. It will be the base of everything. So we have to really think about this. And some examples, what the word is composed of, what categories of things are there, is there only one universe or several, things like this, very deep stuff. Epistemology, on the other hand, deals with the construction of knowledge. So what is possible to be known, the limits of knowledge, which kind of question we will make. So I think this dialogue is a bit with what Ethan was saying about some questions cannot be addressed, that is related to Charles Perrault's book. No? Some questions cannot be addressed. Sometimes people want to address questions because they don't have a very good grasp of the epistemology of the discipline. They are addressing questions that really are not possible to be addressed in the end. So has a strong relationship with the methodological aspects. If ontology asks what is the word like, epistemology asks what we can know about this word. So it's another very important concept. So when you don't have a clarity about this, this will lead to more and more confusion in the minds of the practitioners, in the minds of the archaeologists. So we'll talk most about archaeology. And then if you don't have these issues very clear in your mind, we'll have try to get a piece of this and that, different ideas, and they have totally different ontologies. They are different ways of thinking about the word, and the person doesn't realize and tries to put everything into some model, and it will not work at all. And so these definitions of archaeology, they are textbook definitions. And textbooks are nice because textbooks show the vision that the researcher has about his own discipline. And this vision sometimes is not clear on papers, on things people produce. But when they have to define archaeology in a textbook, it becomes very much clearer what the guy is saying. So archaeology is this discipline of theory and practice for recovery of unobservable hominid behavioral patterns from indirect traces in bad samples. That's nice, no? Archaeology is a social science that studies human societies. And their transformations in time. Archaeology is the study of power. Archaeology is the study of the past. Through the systematic recovery and analysis of material culture. Archaeology is the study of human societies through examination and interpretation of their material remains. Archaeology is the most fun you can have with your pants on. So I prefer this last definition. I think it's great. So what you see here is that actually some of them they are not definitions. They are just, some of them are descriptions of archaeologists do. The other are manifests of faith. But what several of them have, so only 6, but many times you see archaeologists saying that archaeology is the study of the past or is the study of human societies. And there is this rhetoric trick through examination of material stuff. It's just rhetoric. You are not studying past societies because they don't exist. You cannot study from a scientific point of view. You have to study something that exists, material. So we don't study human societies, neither the past. No, we study the material remains. So here is in the end is the material remains, material culture in the end. But you put this through as a rhetoric trick to tell people, look, we study the past societies. No, actually not. Well, I will pass to theory and etc. Kinds of science, or types of science, it's important for people to understand. Many people say archaeology is not a science because you are not, you don't use lab coats, you don't make experiments on a lab and etc. And Manner and Bung, this is a very nice, very important book, is Principles of Biophilosophy, the name of this book. It is very applicable to archaeology. And they put this science as formal, that would be mathematics and logic, do not depend on evidence from the material world to validate their formulas and postulates. And factual sciences, that all others deal with phenomena. So when we talk about archaeology, we are talking about a factual science, deals with phenomena, with the material world, building data from phenomena, and always being confronted with their ability to explain this material world. Among the factual sciences, we can have a second division: experimental sciences, physics, chemistry, and historical sciences, geology, biology, archaeology. Based now on radically different ontologies, materialism and essentialism. Of course, I'm citing Daniel, but Mayer was the guy who said this. So experimental sciences and historical sciences, they have radically different ontologies, and we just saw ontology is a very important thing. The scientific method in archaeology is absolutely aching. It's the same thing that happens in biology, and it's the same thing that happens in the historic sciences and the earth sciences. On the other hand, it's very different from what happens in the other humanities, generally speaking. First, there is a strong hermeneutic component in the archaeological scientific method. There is this author, Frodman, that has some papers on this aspect of the hermeneutic aspect. This hermeneutic, please don't take it as being the postmodern idea of hermeneutics. Is like a more hard thing. Like the idea is that there is this hermeneutic circle. Understanding the whole depends on understanding the parts and vice versa. Is instrumental in understanding how archaeology works. In reality, best being understood as a spiral. When we enter the circle, we can do it from two sides. Little knowing the whole, but interested in the particular, or on the contrary, little knowing the particularities, more interested in the general. The fact is that the correct understanding of the text depends on the integration of general and particular. So they put the word as being something you have to read. And to read, you have to learn how to read. So this transmission of knowledge inside the sciences makes that you have to learn with a teacher. In archaeology, for instance, you have to learn how to read a profile. In the earth sciences, the same. So before you enter this circle, or let's say, before you go to the university, when you pass through a road and you see a road cut, it's just a road cut. Just a barranco. You don't pay attention to that thing. Perhaps there is some grass, the color can change, doesn't matter. After you go into the university and go into geology, for instance, the professor starts to show you, oh, look, you see this road cut. It's not a road cut anymore. Now the name is an outcrop. And you see this thing here has the different color. This is a rock, and it's being transformed into soil. And then you start to see the world absolutely different. This is the hermeneutic cycle. You enter, and then you learn something, and then you go out and go to the theory. The theory changes the way you see. You will see the same thing differently. And then this is a kind of spiral, because you never enter in the same place. You learn something and you begin to read. You really read the word. You start to read the word. So I think this. So Freudman developed this for the earth sciences, but it's absolutely true for archaeology. It's just the same thing. So in archaeology, the testing of hypotheses as put by Binford and the processualism, some stuff that Mike said in his talk, is not carried the way they would like using Hampel's model of testing hypotheses, etc., etc. Testing hypotheses in archaeology is not a strictly logical argument. That's really important. But what happens is in archaeology, as in biology, as in neurosciences, is the multiple working hypothesis method. This was devised by Chamberlain in 1897. Guy wrote a paper about this, and it's absolutely true. It's a very realistic view of the method, and depends on this dialogue between field observation, theory, and things like this. So he proposed that the scientific method, or this idea, this scientific method in archaeology, because there are several scientific methods. We tend to talk about the scientific method as with a single thing. It's not. Several different scientific methods. This is something very important to keep in mind. In this case, it would be a dominant theory. Then this dominant theory would be attacked as the time goes by, because people would perceive that this theory doesn't work so well. No? Then people will start to make that this will lead to working hypotheses, and with time, multiple working hypotheses. Of course, this is kind of ideal view of how this works, but the idea of having multiple working hypotheses is that you will have several hypotheses competing, and then you will see which of these hypotheses are more backed up by data coming from different directions. So that's the idea of triangulation, or the convergence of multiple lines of evidence extracted from the empirical universe, and which points to one or some of the proposed hypotheses, but not to others. I think this addresses the problem of equifinality. The idea is that you can have different hypotheses to explain something, but hopefully, as you gather more data, this data will inevitably point to one more than the other. Of course, we will never know the holy truth, but you have an idea of what's pointing to, what is going to. In a more philosophical jargon, it's called abduction, or inference to the best explanation. This paper by Fogel in 2007 it's a paper published in American Antiquity, where he proposed that what archaeologists do is abduction. It's not induction or deduction. It's abduction that is this inference for the better explanation. Unfortunately, like this paper I think it was not much cited and kind of forgotten, but I think it's really an important point. Sure.
I think maybe one reason that paper hasn't been cited is it's junk.
Oh gosh. Why?
Because I don't disagree with the way you described it at all. But
Perhaps I didn't understand the paper.
who in this, where do theories come from? They come from induction. It's the way you see what your experience is. It's not something that some extraterrestrial came down. And that's what he never addresses. Induction is just as important in science as deduction is. Induction is, that's what the theories are derived from that. You deduce hypotheses from those. You don't test hypotheses, you test implications. If that hypothesis says X, I should find A and B. Oh, I didn't. So now, multiple working hypotheses. But in my mind, this is just me, but don't ever underestimate where theories come from, and that's induction. Yeah, no, not at all. That's a great model. So anyway.
Okay, but so do you mean the Vogelin paper 2007, the abduction paper? You don't agree with it, is it? Okay. Well, we can't talk about over beer, but because I don't know if you have time here. But okay. So now I change subject and we'll talk about cultural evolutionary theory. That is something very important. So now I will read, otherwise we will get out of the time. So archaeology provides the only long-term record of human culture. Therefore, researchers interested in understanding cultural evolution patterns of long duration would greatly benefit from studying and incorporating data provided by archaeological materials. Cultural evolutionary theory postulates that one can approach cultural changes or stasis through evolutionary terms borrowed and then adapted from biological evolutionary theory. Naturally, such terms include selection and drift. In the late 1970s, Robert Dunnell published a proposal that related function and style in archaeology to selection and drift in the material culture. That's the paper Mike told you in his talk. The concept of fitness is at the core of such discussion, since the distinction between functional and stylistic attributes would be related to fitness enhancing versus neutral attributes. More recently, there has been a debate about how to observe and even define fitness in cultural evolution. We believe that the debate about fitness cannot advance properly without assessment of 4 different modes of knowledge that were devised by Greek philosophers, doxa, sophia, techne, and episteme. Here we argue that each of these modes of knowledge will involve different cultural transmission processes and have distinct consequences in terms of cultural fitness. The lack of clarity about this issue can explain some confusion in the rationale presented by several authors. We believe that several key concepts are ill-defined in the anthropological and archaeological literature, and if we continue to use them without proper definitions, only more confusion will be produced. We make clear what we mean by terms we are talking about, such as doxa, sophia, techne, and episteme, and also others that seem obvious and consensual in the cultural evolutionary theory literature at first glance, but that in fact are not, like information, culture, knowledge, and etc. So, information versus knowledge. Information is one of the most widely used concepts in the CET literature, cultural evolution. Yet, this is one of the most ill-defined. Perhaps we should start making clear that information is a purely relational concept, like acceleration, velocity, or fitness. Information does not exist on and of itself. It's a concept applied to processed data. Our brains store external stimuli since we are born, and this configures memories at best, not information. These memories can be called the data. They have to be processed, or recalled, organized, resignified, evaluated, etc., in order to be externalized, conveyed to others by some behavioral channel, speech, writing, dancing, fighting, etc. The definition of information we use is, information is processed data. So information, therefore, is the name we give to a process. It does not have a material existence. So this is my take, if you disagree. Okay. Therefore, it cannot be scientifically studied. It's a conceptual tool, not a subject matter. An important distinction is to be made between information and knowledge. We often find in the literature a rather loose, interchangeable use of these two terms when in fact they should have different meanings. Information can literally be useless. You can be informed that it's raining in Paraty, but if you are not taking a vacation, Paraty, it doesn't matter, that information. And of course, that rains a lot in Paraty. So, information about a celebrity's life that is not even remotely linked to you. Information can be, another aspect is that information can be known to be very important, but in the absence of means to decodify it, it's also useless. So a good example is a letter written in a secret code. So you know there is important information, but you cannot codify. Lastly, information can be latent, meaning it's important, it does exist, but it's not recognized as such. For instance, you can walk leisurely along a trail without noticing footprints signaling that a jaguar and her cub are following the same trail just ahead of you. This last aspect is strongly hermeneutic. You have to learn how to read the footprints. Knowledge, on the other hand, is a complex composite of information from various sources, observation, and reasoning, all these ingredients structured in a way that allow either a better understanding of a general class of phenomena, that is theoretical knowledge, or the skilled performance of a task, that would be practical knowledge. Once knowledge is gained, information will flow in a totally different manner. Therefore, it cannot be treated simply as information without further qualification. Knowledge will, first, filter useless information. Second, enable the decodification of important information that needs a key to be read. 3, allow the recognition of information that's absolutely invisible without it. And fifth, produce new information and be transmitted. Another major difference between information and knowledge is the nature of its transmission. Information can be transmitted in a very simple and direct way, just presenting something to somebody. Knowledge, on the other hand, is much more costly, both to share and to acquire. To be effectively transmitted, knowledge needs a process of teaching and learning, and not simple imitation or adoption. Moreover, knowledge has to be consciously acquired, even if unconsciously performed. So you have to consciously acquire knowledge. Then you can perform it without thinking about it. So doxa. Doxa is a Greek term that can be translated as belief or opinion, and constitutes what we call common sense, or a mixture of opinions, beliefs, and prejudice constructed in an unsystematic way, and what form the fabric of our relatively uninformed ideas of how the world operates. Doxa can be fed by the other modalities of knowledge, albeit in a superficial way, and produces a hybrid mental constructs without any internal logical coherence. Even if flawed from a formal point of view, doxa is extremely important from the individual's point of view, since it allows navigating the world without the need of rationalization or logical coherence. For example, knowing how to behave in the front of other people, and etc. Sophia can be understood as wisdom or informed knowledge, usually gained through careful observation of the world, and which comes with experience and old age. Sophia, in the sense of wisdom, is by far the least successfully transmitted knowledge, given its strongly personal characteristic. It's important to note that Sophia does not imply any explanation of the world, but gathering sophisticated knowledge about how it works in some ways, understanding patterns, but not the mechanisms or reason behind the patterns, only the patterns. that can help navigating through life. In some cases, when Sophia can be perceived through external signals or practices, it can be eventually incorporated, and note that we are not using the term copied, by other members of the group. As time passes, it can become current practice and part of a stable cultural trait whose learning demands years of practice, or what we call techne. Techne is another Greek word whose meaning is subtle but can be loosely translated as art or craft, and whose etymology is easily linked to the term technology in the same sense as archaeologists use it, like lithic technology, ceramic technology. The most important distinction between doxa and Sophia techne is the mechanism of transmission. Copying is not enough to ensure the transmission of Sophia or techne. A mechanism of active teaching has to be developed, even if this mechanism seems to be copying from the Western point of view. A good example comes from the Eastern traditional martial arts. The teacher passes the knowledge by means of a complex interchange between physical demonstration of how to perform a given technique, movement and posture correction of the pupils, often without any speech, just manipulating the pupil's body by means of fixing angles and directions, and ensuring that the pupils will repeat the exercise to exhaustion and for several years until they are considered fit to perform a given task. This all happens with a very sparse exchange of words. There are several accounts of this process in the literature and etc. So, an important aspect of the techne is that it has to be learned consciously, since it involves an active engaging in trying to perform a complex chain of actions, but it can be performed unconsciously in terms of what is nowadays called muscular memory. This is especially true in activities that demand fast response to unpredictable events, such as hunting, sailing, or warfare. Actions that were initially awkward and painfully learned become a second nature of the performer. And this is important. No mental representation is needed for their execution. Okay? Episteme. Episteme is real knowledge, quote unquote, which we can translate nowadays as scientific and not technological knowledge. It's radically different from the doxa and at the same time transcends Sophia and techne in the sense that it aims explanations and to do so relies on the scientific method rather than personal experience to build knowledge about the world. It allows a deeper level of understanding about how things work and reveals underlying patterns that cannot be perceived by unguided learning, or doxa, or by single-person life experience, or by guided learning as Sophia. Personal learning as Sophia. It's important to place a theoretical distinction between episteme as science and techne as technology. The difference between them residing in the aim of explanation in the first and the lack of such imperative in the second. So, technology does not aim to explain the world. In common, both are related to material issues, obeying an empirical, pragmatic standard. Not anything goes in this realm, and therefore their modes of transmission and their potential fitness are absolutely distinct from the other modes. In explaining how things work, episteme allows a geometric growth in techne and a feedback process occur, with new technologies allowing an increase in the possibility and tools of scientific investigations. To deal with issues related to episteme, other theoretical models, generally not discussed in the CET literature, but coming from the philosophy of science, have to be applied. So, and this we don't see happen. Culture. One of the most important problems we faced in the development of cultural evolution theory is related to the definitions of culture employed by the authors. It's possible to perceive two major strengths. One, idealist, culture as ideas, information, mental states. The other, materialist, culture as behavior, artifacts, and savoir-faire. These two stances reflect deep, profound difference in how the researchers view their subject matter, means cultural phenomena. So this is related to ontology again. Ontology says if you see the word, if you see culture as mentalist, idealist, or if you see culture as a materialist. So has to do with ontology. The two strands are ontological stances, meaning the whole world view of the researcher is influenced by the chosen definition. Of course, such choices will entail consequences regarding the formulation of theories and their associated methods and techniques. The definition of culture we use here is culture is learned and shared behavior. Very dry definition, but it encompasses pretty much everything. So anthropologists don't study cultures, just as sociologists don't study societies. Most professionals actually study behavior or its consequences, meaning performances, storytelling, artifacts, etc. The observation made by the professionals in these two academic fields are related to human behavior, analyzed through the concept of culture, society, etc. Where these same behaviors analyzed from a psychological perspective, the approach would be, let's say, Freudian or Jungian. Kinship systems, for example, are not something real. They are analytical categories or synthetic, depending on the level of analysis, used to give meaning to the behavior that individuals, those indeed material entities, present when related to other individuals in the same group. Once this becomes clear in our minds, it's easier to perceive some problems with the idealist view of culture. Mental states and ideas are not culture. They are for sure necessary for cultural manifestations to emerge, develop, and pass through changes that we call evolutionary process. But they are building blocks of culture, not culture itself. If they are not manifested and shared, they mean nothing, cannot be studied, and will remain just as voices inside our heads. One final observation that seems to remain unnoticed is that while we can concede that mental states and ideas have empirical existence, since they are concepts related to physical manifestations composed of electric signals decoded by neurons and therefore can be considered a potential subject within a scientific framework, such as neuroscience, the same does not apply to information, as we mentioned before. To say that culture is information is the same as saying that one concept means another concept and is related to some material and it's related to some material manifestation. Something that can be subject of scrutiny only within the philosophical or theological, not scientific domain. So if you say culture is information, no, a concept is another concept, you cannot study it because it has no material existence. Fitness and culture. The borrowing of concepts between different areas of knowledge is extremely fruitful and even unavoidable in the case of archaeology. However, borrowing has to be made with due caution. We start considering that fitness is an ill-defined and problematic concept in biology. In very general terms, fitness is a relational property which reflects the relationship between an organism and the environment where it's immersed. To be sure, the way Darwin used the term implied that some individual organisms were fitter than others in relation to the environment they live. As put by Ariel Lewontin, the term fit was used by Darwin in the sense of everyday English, to fit in a lock and key metaphor, where the organism would match the existing environment in a better way. According to the author, the scheme of Darwin's idea of fitness was 1. Natural properties of the individual leading to 2. Fitness to the environment that would have influences on 3. Reproductive rates, and ultimately 4. Changes in the representation of a population. Later developments in genetics that culminated in the evolutionary synthesis led to attempts to measure or scale fitness based on a reproductive success and considering demographic and ecological details as irrelevant, citing the author. Not to mention historic concepts, of course. The scheme would be 1. Reproductive rates, which would mean 2. Reproductive fitness, and therefore 3. Changes in representation. The first question to be asked by proponents of the application of the concept of fitness in culture is, which of these different concepts is going to be borrowed? Examining the more recent CET literature, it appears that the fitness concept employed is the one related to population genetics, although this is not often explicitly stated. The concept seems to be used in a rather loose manner as something that will benefit the holder of some cultural trait. Some authors have considered the concept of fitness so primordial to the point of stating that for a process to be evolutionary, whether it be Darwinian evolution or not, change must occur on the basis of the fitness function. This, if not, it means if change is random, it's not due to evolution, but to processes such as drift. So, this is rather problematic for cultural evolutionary theory, not only because fitness is itself a problematic concept, as we saw, but because such stance hinders the study of cultural process from the outset. If we say that cultural evolution is evolution only if fitness is involved, and the very concept of fitness is not well grasped, we cannot begin to study it, at least under the brand of evolution. It will be simply cultural studies. However, stochastic processes, such as drift, can lead to important evolutionary outcomes, what is called stochastic evolution by some authors. This leads to a deeper problem related to the very definition of evolution, which in our vision is not necessarily related solely to the fitness and selection, much less to genes, but to changes in a given system over time. And now I'm citing what everybody said before, a process. Now, from this point of view, evolution is a process which occurs whenever there is variability, imperfect transmission of that variability, and differential persistence of that variability. The role that natural selection may play in a given evolutionary process is something to be inferred, discussed in a case-by-case basis, and not something that is part of the definition of evolution from the onset. Evolution is perhaps best understood as a process illustrated by a triangle whose vertices are adaptation, chance, and history. Assigning a specific case to a given region of this triangle is the ultimate goal of an evolutionary explanation. Moreover, a single concept, such as drift, can be related to very different processes. For instance, a genetic bottleneck promotes a change in the population that can be labeled drift, but a bottleneck can be due to a volcanic eruption, that is chance, or to the migration of a docile population towards a new territory where no adaptation is required since the environmental conditions are similar to homeland. In this case, the fate of the new population will be due to a founder effect, that is history. Of course, history, adaptation, and chance are intertwined in the real world. That's why in this figure there are patches showing fuzzy areas, since part of the explanation can be due to adaptation, part to chance, part to history in different measures. The triangle can also be read in a different manner. Different portions of the same organism, or aspects as modularity, or aspects of the same culture, or even parts of the same artifact, as Mike said in his talk, can evolve due to the strong selective pressures, others due to history, others to chance. An evolutionary explanation, as any scientific narrative, will choose which aspects to stress and which to disregard and/or simplify, generally providing a single or a very restricted set of most likely scenarios, illustrated in the triangle as this cross. So, Sober 2000 asks, should fitness be defined in terms of a one-generation time frame? Why focus on expected number of offspring rather than grand offspring or more distant descendants still? Expected number of offspring is not always the right way to define fitness, emphasis added. Even more problematic from the evolutionary point of view, the definition of fitness as expected number of offspring has a one-generation time scale. How can we use a concept that is bound to such a short time to address evolutionary questions? As put by Sober, why think of fitness in this way rather than having a longer time horizon? Here the concept of bet hedging matches very well the need of a concept of fitness that makes into account a long-term perspective of cultural evolution. Bet hedging is a survival strategy in which an isogenic population minimizes the temporal variance of surviving offspring and so maximizes the geometric mean fitness across various environments. you'll see what I mean in the figure. This is achieved by individuals that stochastically develop a phenotype of reduced fitness that may be better adapted to a future environment. So this is a figure. So you have two populations. The red one is fitter, has more offspring, but in the long term, it goes extinct. Okay. So, in short, contrary to the simpler assumptions of population genetics, where environment is constant and fitness is just the number of offspring in the next generation that can reproduce, what we can call fitness 1, the best fitness enhancing strategy in fluctuating environments, be natural or social environments, is not to increase the number of offspring, but to ensure that a fair number will survive when environmental conditions are less than optimal, what we can call fitness 2, maintaining their immediate reproductive fitness in suboptimal levels. Since fluctuating environments are the norm in Earth's history, the concept of fitness 2, the second concept, is probably way more adequate to deal with evolutionary questions than the ecological, genetic-based, and temporary shallow concept of fitness 1. This idea was applied and developed in the archaeological literature by several authors, but has not been much used in the CET literature. Taking cultural traits as units of cultural evolutionary analysis that, following Mike's work, we reached the somewhat counterintuitive but scientifically stimulating conclusion that Homo erectus was the fittest, fitness 2, of our genus, both physically and culturally. The 1.5 million years longevity of the biological and cultural phylogeny that produced hand axes, domesticated fire, and probably other related cultural behaviors that did not survive for us to see, and spread through almost all kinds of biomes is breathtaking, and the odds that are scant that any other species of the Homo genus, including ours, will last for such a long time. So, conclusion, theoretical confusion and lack of clarity stems from conflicting ontological and epistemological stance. An ideational approach to culture does not lead to fruitful insights either in archaeology or in cultural evolutionary theory. Biology, archaeology, and the earth sciences are absolutely aching regarding both the scientific method employed and more general epistemological issues. There is a tendency in cultural evolutionary theory to continue to conceive and model the transmission of cultural traits without differentiating between modes of knowledge or concepts of fitness. Another problem to be dealt is the fact that the theoretical foundations of CET came originally from population genetics to disciplines that are not very interesting in deep time ranges. There is an excessive focus on information and ideas, and my stance is that we have to take a harder grasp on the whole of artifacts in the transmission process, artifacts and behaviors, and especially in archaeology, we have to deal with artifacts because we cannot observe behaviors. And last but not least, I think there in the CET literature, there is some kind of flirting with the idea of progress. You see in some papers that there is I don't know, hard to say. I should make some examples, but my time is over. But there is some flirting with the idea of progress, flirting the literature, like ever increasing of cultural traits, like they become more and more sophisticated. The ratchet idea. No, and I don't think it's a very fruitful approach. So thank you very much. And sorry, since I was reading, I don't know if anybody raised the hand, but...
But now it's time. So thank you, Astolfo. Do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you a lot, Astolfo. I was thinking, well, I appreciate Mark, like the fact that biology, archaeology,
yeah.
Of course, but what do you think about the shared part and the difference? Because, for instance, when you talk about the hermeneutic circle, identify some of this reflexivity in biology also, because the biological being is investigating and this does not appear in the earth sciences at the same time, right?
No, it appears a lot.
Also in the earth science, in which sense?
Actually, Frodman, the guy who wrote the paper, he's a philosopher and geologist.
Yeah.
So it was all written towards geology. Like the idea of the hermeneutic circle and etc. was all applied to geology, actually.
Okay, and so you think
Yeah, so I applied to archaeology and biology. But actually the paper is, the several papers he wrote, everything is applying this idea of the hermeneutic circle to geology, to the earth sciences.
Okay.
Because the example I gave, you have to learn how to read como chama a lâmina de copo? A thin section, a cell in a thin section, somebody has to teach you how to read that thing. No? The outcrop in geology is the same. You pass through it, never pay attention. Until you enter the graduate program in geology, an outcrop is never an outcrop anymore. You cannot pass through it and try to read what the text. No? So I think from the epistemological point of view, they are very, very, very similar. Something that in the other humanities, I don't see this thing, the similarity so close. So the idea of the hermeneutic cycle. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is that I would think the hermeneutic cycle, I know that is coming from humanities scholars more so.
It's coming from theology. Yeah. So it was how to make interpretations about the holy text. No. Yeah. And of course, it was developed in literature. Yeah. So, but it's a tool to read texts, not as an epistemological thing. I don't know if I'm being clear, but what put archaeology, the earth sciences, and biology together is not only the hermeneutic cycle. Of course, there is a hermeneutic cycle in the humanities. I think so, but the triangulation or the abduction part, that kinds of puts archaeology much akin to the other one. Generally speaking, of course, each one has its particularities, but I think the epistemology, broadly speaking, the majority of the similarities are between archaeology, earth sciences, and biology, more than the other science. Just my other question. Everybody's tired, no?
I'm not a very, I want to say I'm not a very nuanced or accomplished thinker, honestly. I just kind of brute force my way through stuff.
Yeah, me too.
and so what we're talking about is very complex issues about how you generate knowledge, how you evaluate concepts. And one thing I tell my kind of first year classes at universities, I usually begin with, everything I'm telling you is a lie, meaning everything is more complicated than I'm going to tell you in this first year course in university. Much more complicated. And so I'm trying to think about what I do and trying to interpret it and understand it in kind of the way you've spoken and the way you've spoken you've spoken. It's hard for me even to articulate. I think, I mean, I understand many of the concepts you've talked about in epistemology and ontology, but I'm actually just writing a paper and trying to produce this output, I think this is the answer. I'm not very good at going back and analyzing how I did. That's part of what I think you're talking about. So some of the difficulty in talking about it is it's incredibly complex. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think just to make a comment, or comments is that we can do this stuff well done even without giving names. Like what we generally do. Well, philosophers call it abduction, or a mix between back and forth between induction and deduction, something like this. You can choose which scheme. I don't know if this will change a lot your practice again. Like if you're a good scholar, I think it will make your work interesting. But on the other hand, I think it's good to think about this and to see, oh yeah, okay, that's pretty much what I do, or perhaps, I do this, but I never thought about doing a bit differently or something like this. So I think doesn't have, the only thing that I think is really important, and of course we all share this, is that we are aware of our ontology. So I think this is a very important thing. Once you are aware of which ontology is ruling your worldview, it's a major thing. And what happens is that I think the majority of the people don't have this idea that ontology should be very important, like something that you have in your mind in a very clear manner. No? Most people don't. So I think this is a good explanation for the state of confusion that rules the whole discipline, like archaeology. Like biologists don't have this problem. They are all operating, I mean, at least the evolutionary biologists, they are all operating under an evolutionary ontology, so it's okay. Okay. Don't forget the microphone. But just to finish, but in archaeology, this is far from clear. Far from clear. So you have the same person using sometimes concepts, etc., that are really essentialist, together with a materialist, everything together in some ideas that are not logically articulated.
Yeah, I'm not that optimistic about biologists are good ontologists. I think that there are a lot of confusion too.
Yeah.
And like what I asked João, I think that in the end it's about this. I believe that we better understand like how general is evolution and how things change, we should have more training on philosophy, ontology, and the meaning of this thing. I think that's the solution. Then we could see like how the universe is similar and how it's different, and choose how we like to see it, more similar, more different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the take-home message is like congratulations to the biology department because they hired João. Oh? Not because João is a nice guy, but because this is so rare. It's so rare to have somebody teaching philosophy of science in the university. Really rare.
Got a couple of comments to make. One is we can beat up on anthropologists and archaeologists, and I know in the paper that you were reading from is one that you were gracious enough to send me a while back for comments on. And he makes a great distinction between information and knowledge. You also point out in there, and I remember saying you underestimated the number of definitions of culture. In 1951, two anthropologists, Rober and Kluckhohn, and you've never heard those names, and you never should have. But they came up in 1951 with over 300 definitions of culture. And we can pat ourselves, our biologists, on the back and say, "Phew, thank God we're not anthropologists." Well, at last count, there were 27 definitions of a species. We know what those are. There's the paleontological species, biological species, keep going on and on. The Ernst Mayer's definition of, it was long before him too, of definition, two organisms that can breed and produce reproducible offspring, or offspring that can reproduce. And a paleontologist goes, wow, great, what does that do for me? I can't see those guys a million years ago. You mate with her? No, you can't do it, so you have the paleontological species. And there's 23 others that make sense. So you pick, you choose your poison and you move on and define what you're talking about, move on and get it done. Last thing I want to point out is one of those, there was a great list of publications that you had that talked about fitness, I guess, or whatever it was. But you had Doug Fukushima in there, and good biologist. But every textbook that he ever done, and I've gone and looked at the rest of them, when they talk about evolution, culture is never mentioned. And you could say, well, it's a biological textbook. How many species, you're an expert, how many species would you say have culture? You say that the monkeys? Most. Good man. Most. So it's never talked about. And that's one of the things that really has alienated archaeology. Not alienated, but it's like, oh, well, it's got to be something different. But even Ernst Mayr in 1991 said, the Harvard biologist, evolution is not just behavior. And amen to that. That's all I got to say. Great.
Any more questions? Okay, people. So our audience online is very enthusiastic, and yeah, really, we have a lot of people online too. So I would like to thank you for coming today. It was, my point of view, a wonderful afternoon. I hope you also enjoy it. 4 hours. Yes, and let's give a round of applause. And if you want to continue the conversation, we are going to have dinner somewhere near the university, so you're also invited to join us. Thank you again.
Yeah. That was easy.